When Juno awoke, the world had no edges. The fog had fused with the horizon, and the ridge no longer looked like a ridge at all, just a rise of light pulsing beneath a film of breath, as if the land were wearing its own condensation. The trees were silhouettes without borders. The ocean was a suggestion. Distance had forgotten how to subtract. She didn't know how long she'd been there. The tape deck beside her was still warm, humming faintly, though no reels turned and no light glowed red. She sat up, and the ground yielded the way a chest yields to a hand pressed between breaths. The hum rose to meet her. It wasn't sound so much as consent. Each time she blinked, the fog changed shade, like a pupil adjusting to a kindly lamp. "Okay," she said to no one, to everything. Her voice arrived and then hovered just before it ought to fade, as if the air enjoyed keeping company with syllables. The tape deck gave a delicate click of nothing. Heat curled from its metal the way steam lifts from bread when a cold knife enters. She placed her palm flat on the lid. It vibrated to the rhythm of her pulse for a moment, then slowed, adopting the more patient cadence under the soil. It was like laying a hand on a sleeping back and being told the story of lungs. She stood. Her knees answered without the usual committee. Footprints printed themselves half a second ahead of her boots. Courteous predictions in the damp. Nothing in needlepoint was where it was supposed to be, and yet nothing was lost. Porches approached the street with more humility. Mailboxes waited with their mouths closed in a discipline of silence. The street sign showed names without arrows, trusting locals to remember orientation. It felt like the morning after a remembered prayer, and still the edges refused come back. The sky and the sea negotiated the line between them the way two old friends negotiate a bill. Lovingly, with mischief, each trying to pay. She passed the diner. Its windows were blank with intention, showing only the suggestion or outline and the soft interior glow that had replaced electricity with understanding. Inside, chairs stood a respectful distance from tables, like mourners who had decided on the correct proximity to grief. A coffee pot wore the dignified tilt of a deacon's hat. Janine's apron hung from a hook. It lifted slightly when Juno walked by, as if acknowledging a colleague who had taken a night shift without complaint. Down by the harbor, the docks were bandages laid across a healed wound, useful now, mostly for memory. The water had the composure of someone who has apologized and been forgiven. No chop, no skim. The gulls stood on pilings with their beaks closed, reconsidering their reputations. Juno climbed toward the ridge. The path was a rumor her body remembered. The air grew thicker, not oppressive, not humid. Thick like a wool blanket in winter when the window has been cracked open for decency. The hum waited at each bend. When she paused, it paused. When she quickened, it allowed. There was a politeness to it that made her throat sting with gratitude she had not earned. At the crest, the ground brightened in those old familiar lines. They were dim now, gold folded back into ore, but still certainly themselves. A film of breath covered everything, the landscape's condensation trapped halfway between revealing and protecting. She knelt and brushed two fingers across one of the paler veins. Warmth answered, and with a single image, the underside of the table where a child's hand had stuck a piece of gum and been ashamed and then not. "Hey," she said softly, to the vein, to the table, to the child who did not need forgiving and got it anyway. The fog parted an inch. A figure came forward from the side path, and for a second she thought it was her grandmother. The posture fooled her, upright, kind, decisive. But the hat was wrong and the jacket too modern. And then the person was Micah, eyes ringed the way eyes ring when someone has stayed awake inside an idea for too long. "You hear it?" he asked, though the question was its own answer. "I feel it," she said. "Hearing happened earlier. This is the part after hearing." He nodded. "Do you remember what we did exactly?" His mouth included a crooked smile. The sort instruments were when they've been tuned so perfectly they want to be played incorrectly just to prove they still belong to humans. "We didn't do it," she said. "We stopped doing other things." He crouched beside the vein and pressed his palm to it. The fog above them thinned like milk poured carefully. "I kept thinking there would be he searched for the word, a test, or a cost, a list of things we had to give up. We gave up pretending," she said. It didn't sound clever when she said it. It sounded heavy and adequate. He laughed once. Right. The tape deck in her bag clicked twice. She took it out. It hummed in a scale neither major nor minor, something with rooms in it. The lid released as if answering a knock. Inside, the reels lay quiet, but for the first time she noticed a film of gold along the inner rim. Not dust but polish, exactly at the spot where motion and resistance prefer to meet. She shut it, and the hum deepened, as if pleased with being witnessed. "What time is it?" Micah asked, then immediately apologized with his eyebrows. "Sorry, I don't think it's a time," she said. "It's a count." He considered this the way you consider rain, as fact and as opinion. 42, he said under his breath, the old rhythm returning not to rule but to remind. A wind tried to start and didn't. Leaves lifted their white backs again, giving the light a surface to write on. The ridge exhaled once. On the breath, Juno felt 1,000 small drafts. The exactly measured gusts that always passed under the high school's side door at noon. The steady kitchen breeze that moved a calendar one day too fast every February. The soft lift along her grandmother's sleeve when the old woman raised a hand before she spoke to children. The drafts braided, then untwined. Each allowed its own signature. She took another step, and the world widened rather than moved. Immediately the fog shaped a corridor. Walls of vapor rose cleanly, with the crisp edges of an idea expressed finally in the right tongue. "Counting rooms," Micah said, squinting. "Do you see them?" She did. At even intervals along the corridor, spaces like chapels, fog recessed to make alcoves. Each held something ordinary: a teacup, a spool of thread, a small silver hammer, a carpenter's pencil gnawed nearly to nothing, a single book with its cover rubbed blank. The alcoves breathed. As the corridor inhaled, the objects brightened. As it exhaled, they dimmed. Juno stepped toward the spool and felt, not memory, but alignment. The sensation of an action that had made a line between before and after and then stayed to hold it. "What are they?" she asked. "Proofs," Micah said. Not of what happened, of what held. She reached out and did not touch the spool. The air between her fingertip and the wood warmed, the same warmth as the vein beneath the soil. The corridor listened to her restraint with appreciation. At the far end, the fog lifted as if a conductor had tipped 2 fingers. There, beyond the counting rooms, lay the harbor, but not as she'd left it. The bay was an ear. The town's roofs were instruments lying on their backs, soundboards turned to sky. The church spire was a tuning peg. The cannery's long spine radiated the fatigue of usefulness that refuses to be ashamed of itself. And in the center, where the channel cleft the sandbar, the water rose and fell with the steady decorum of sleeping. Juno and Micah stood at the threshold and watched the world be itself in a language they were only just fluent enough to follow. "What's it waiting for now?" he asked. "For us to stop asking what it's waiting for," she said gently. A smile found her, without needing to embarrass her. But also, maybe, for the answer we promised we'd give. "The note," he said, serious now, "the one only we can hold. Down in town, the first lights of morning, that is, the habit of morning, breathe low, not bulbs. Windows full of people turning toward kettles and curtains with the politeness of newly shared air. A dog pawed open a bedroom door and sat on the floor beside a bed with its whole body dignified. The diner's griddle warmed in its bones and didn't hiss because no one deserved to be startled out of this. Juno tried her voice again. It came like a pencil's first mark on paper, less line than intention. She inhaled on 4. She held on the pause and felt the pause hold her back, an embrace that does not claim, a bracket that trusts what it contains. When she let the note out, it was not a note. It was her first sound, the one asked for by the harbor, the one that might have been crying, might have been listening, a vowel broad enough to seat the town. Micah joined. His came lower, a planked sail. It steadied without pinning. After a few seconds, the right few, another voice slipped in from the path behind, careful and exact. Janine, whose laughter had always warm metal. She sang like someone folding a napkin. Then the mechanic, thin, confident, unapologetically off by a hair, which is how machines confess they are mortal. A child's voice arrived, held too pure and then broken, repaired by an adult who believed in teaching without scolding. The sound built slowly, almost embarrassed by its own rightness, until the corridor itself gave back harmonics it had saved in its fog. The ridge did not glow. It steadied. The gold veins underfoot didn't brighten. They relaxed, like a fist forgetting it was a fist. The harbor didn't answer with light. It answered with warmth that could not have come from the sun. In the sewing room air above the houses, threads reassembled not to correct but to accompany. The radar dish on Cemetery Hill tilted its face to the in-between. Juno's lungs began to ache, the good ache that says enough because you gave it, not stop because you stole it. She released the note with the same care with which she had made it. The count finished itself inside her ribs. Silence returned as a colleague rather than a judge. In that new quiet, the tape deck in her hand hummed, clicked, and, without benefit battery or plug, rolled both reels a fraction of a turn, not to capture, to signify belonging. It was the tiniest movement, and it sent a thrill up the trajectory of her arm as meaningful as an oath. The fog around the counting rooms folded back into itself, not erased, not dismissed, archived. At each alcove, the ordinary thing breath once. The teacup recognized the hands that had warmed it for years without thanks. The spool remembered the seam it had held through last winter. The hammer forgave the nail. The book put its cover back on like a good coat. Edges are coming back, Micah said, surprised at the sadness in his voice. They're not endings, Juno replied. They're frames. We can't hang anything without them. They walked down the path in a world that had relearned the pleasure of outline. The shoreline took its line. The horizon rehired its duty. Distance started subtracting and found the arithmetic pleasurable again. They passed a mirror in a shop window and saw themselves exactly when they passed. No delay, no opinion. The glass, however, held behind their faces the ghost of the ridge. Not as spectacle, not as warning, but the way a locket holds a picture. Privately, loyally, ready to be shown without exhibitionism when asked by a kind question. At her grandmother's gate, Juno paused, then went in. The house had kept watch without tiring. In the sewing room, the threads lay calm within their wood, the map not asserting itself, and yet available to anyone who needed to be reminded where the town had put its lungs. The tomato pincushion looked exactly like a tomato. The novelty had become an honor. She set the tape deck on the table. It gave a quiet, satisfied sigh that was probably the chair. She pressed play without expectation, which is a correct way. For a few seconds, her own breathing, the rasp of winter cloth against winter cloth, then a sound that could have been rain, under eaves but wasn't, then her grandmother's voice, but only 3 words, and they belonged in no tense. Hold it kindly. The tape clicked off on its own. That felt like consent. Later, minutes, hours, a portion of day of the unpretentious sort. She walked back onto the porch. Janine sat on the steps with 2 mugs. Micah had found the porch rail and was apologizing to it under his breath for the years he'd leaned with more weight than gratitude. "How long do you think it lasts?" he asked, not from fear, just from the human need to put flammable things in fireproof cans labeled when. As long as it did, Juno said, and then longer because we know how to pause now. Across the street, a boy practiced whistling and failed beautifully. The tone he missed was a door left open. A woman watering a plant did not need watered, smiled at her own reflex, and set the can down. A dog barked once. Not at nothing, not at everything, at the pleasure of the bark fitting the morning. The ridge lay where it had always lain. It wore nothing. It asked nothing. It kept the beat, not as a metronome, but as a neighbor. Juno lifted her mug. The steam wrote nothing legible and did it generously. She held the warmth with the uncomplicated religion of hands. The air tasted of iron and salt and the citrus of cold. Edges had returned, sure, but under them ran the promise of the count, the practice of the pause, the roped-off areas where mercy does its invisible construction. The world had not become miraculous. It had admitted it had been all along. When the wind went through the lilacs, they answered with a plan for June. The plan included bees and shade and the oldest, kindest arguments between scent and memory. Juno breathed in time with the world that had joined her. She looked once toward the ridge, not to ask, not to check, not to worship, but to include. The fog over it wore the easy posture of choir on break. If there was a door, it was open by habit, closed by respect, and nobody was afraid to touch the handle. Somewhere inside, below thought where true decisions occur, she offered the smallest aiming a body can make, a breath held a fraction longer than it needed to be, a hand placed on the nearest good wood, the note she did not sing because the note was being sung by everything else. The tape deck warmed her palm. The reels did not turn. The hum did not rise. The edges were back. And yet the whole of Needlepoint, docks and roofs and streets and soft, decent rooms, continued to square itself around a beat that did not belong to clocks. Slow, steady, shared. By evening, Needlepoint had forgotten how to end a day. The sun, that old metronome of departure, hovered too long above the water, balanced between fatigue and awe, as if reluctant to turn away from the light it had discovered beneath the surface. The horizon had no appetite for closure. Its colors refused their natural order, amber leaking into violet, violet into green, green into something unnamed, a spectrum undecided about where to stop. Even the shadows seemed restless, stretching thin across fences and roofs, bending toward the ridge like parishioners leaning forward for a benediction that never quite arrived. Juno stood by the fence behind her grandmother's house, the board still warm from the day's memory of sunlight. The air was electric, dense, pressurized, but not dangerous. It was a weight of anticipation, not threat, the kind of silence that fills the lungs of concert hall, right before the bow meets the first string. The hum had changed again. It wasn't beneath the ground anymore. It wasn't inside the ridge or the sea or the air. It was everywhere and everything, threading through her pulse, braided with her breath, moving in and out of her like tide through a harbor gate. She could feel the hum inside her teeth, behind her eyes, in the slow arithmetic of her heartbeat. The rhythm wasn't hers alone. Every exhale she made seemed to find an answering breath elsewhere in the valley. When she blinked, she imagined she could see the town inhaling, windows flexing faintly, curtains expanding, roofs rising by a fraction of an inch. At the edge of her vision, the horizon trembled. The ridge wasn't glowing, not yet, but it had the look of something trying to remember how. Then she heard footsteps on the gravel. Micah appeared at the gate, his silhouette golden from the last light that refused to die. He carried a small, cracked radio, the same one that had once been nothing but static, now glowing faintly from within like a heart rediscovering its duty. His hands shook as he lifted it. "It started broadcasting again," he said, breathless. "But it's not any frequency I can map. It's coming from nowhere or everywhere." He turned the dial. The sound that came wasn't tone or signal or static. It was speech, but speech slow beyond language, stretched into meaning itself. A voice, singular, without gender, speaking with a cadence that seemed carved from the space between breaths. Each syllable felt deliberate, ancient, and impossibly gentle. "We learned your shapes. We borrowed your waiting. Now give back the sound you took." Juno's skin prickled. The words didn't echo. They nested, layering themselves in the air, refusing to fade. She could feel them rearranging her heartbeat. The ground trembled, not with fear, but recognition. Every window in Needlepoint flickered gold, as if each house were exhaling the same memory, and then went dark. Streetlights blinked once, surrendering to something larger than electricity. The ridge began to glow from within. Thin seams of light spread upward through the soil, veins running in reverse, like roots remembering the sky. The glow traveled across the valley floor, slow but unstoppable, each pulse beating in perfect time with the breath in Juno's chest. Then came the pull. Not wind, not gravity, something more intimate, a tug that started behind her ribs, as if her heartbeat were being gently braided into another's. The sound, if it could still be called sound, threaded through her, weaving itself into her pulse, her lungs, her history. She felt it connect her to everyone who had ever stood on this ground. To Janine at her counter, her hands forever smelling faintly of coffee and kindness. To the children whose laughter once ricocheted off the harbor walls. To the old fisherman who had sworn the sea sang back to him. Every heartbeat she'd ever known, every silence she'd ever kept, vibrated now as one. It was unbearable. It was exquisite. Micah dropped the radio. The glow inside it pulsed once more, then stilled. He looked up, his eyes wet, his voice shaking between fear and awe. "It's alive," he said. "It's not memory anymore. It's trying to finish what we started." Juno's throat tightened. "And what's that?" He smiled through tears, a child confessing something holy. "Listening." The ridge opened, but not like before. There was no eruption of gold, no spectacle of light overwhelming shadow. It unfolded like a sigh, soft and endless, a shimmer spreading outward like the tide deciding to return home. Within it, faint silhouettes began to form. People, yes, but not as they'd been. They appeared as outlines of memory, translucent figures flickering between presence and emotion. Juno saw Janina's laughter, Micah's father's patience, her grandmother as forgiveness shaped into human outline, and beyond them, shapes she didn't recognize but somehow understood, the memory of kindness itself, the sound of mercy, the gesture of waiting turned into light. The air pulsed once, twice, then spoke again, not with sound, but directly through thought, bypassing the fragile machinery of language. "You kept our silence. We'll keep your light." Juno gasped. Her feet left the ground, not floating but weightless, as though gravity had remembered its truer allegiance was to rhythm, not restraint. The fog around her crystallized into luminous fragments. Small shards of air turned visible. They rose in slow spirals, like snow learning to fall upward. The world shimmered with grace. Micah reached for her hand. His fingers brushed the edge of her light, but passed through it. She was glowing now, softly at the borders, her outline unraveling into radiant dust. Her grandmother's voice arrived on a hum, warm and familiar, every syllable shaped by love and inevitability. "It's not taking you, love," she said. "It's including you." The words settled in her like the end of a story that didn't end. Juno looked down. The town was breathing. Every house pulsed once more, golden and alive. The harbor rippled with gentle light, as if applauding without hands. The ridge shone from within, veins of brilliance tracing new constellations beneath the soil. And above it all, the sky began to hum, not loudly, but fully, a tone vast enough to cradle the horizon. Micah stood on the fence line, eyes wide, tears streaking down his cheeks, his lips moving but making no sound. And then, for the briefest heartbeat, the world stopped. The hum ceased. The tide froze. The wind held its breath. No pulse. No sound. No air. Only one final note. It emerged from everywhere and nowhere at once, clear and infinite, tender beyond comprehension. It vibrated through the soil, through bone, through memory, through everything that had ever dared to listen. It spread across the sky like a promise too big for words, like the very idea of completion made audible. The note carried the warmth of every forgiveness, the ache of every unfinished prayer, the rhythm of every silence that had ever waited for an answer. It went on, not echoing, not fading, just existing, perfectly sustained, the sound the world realized it had been heard. And when it finally resolved, the ridge exhaled. The light dimmed to something livable. The air softened. The sun, satisfied at last, slipped below the horizon without resistance. Juno's feet touched earth again. Her body felt heavier, but only in the comforting way that presence does. Micah's hand found hers. This time it held. The hum was gone, yet its absence hummed. The sea breathed once more, the trees swayed, and the sky above needlepoint turned the soft blue of a bruise healing. And somewhere in the stillness, woven through every living thing that had learned to wait, a new rhythm began to form. One that wasn't asking to be heard, only to be continued. A rhythm that said, with the gentle certainty of dawn, "We listened. We remained. We remember the sound." When sound returned, it was smaller, gentler, like the sea remembering a song. Juno found herself standing in the middle of an open field that shouldn't have existed. The ridge was not where the ridge had always been. It had shifted inward, as if the hill had taken a modest bow and, in bowing, made room. Grass lay in careful braids, each blade beaded with moisture that held tiny suns. The field felt curated by something that had learned restraint. No stones to stub feet, no briars to punish ankles. Even the wind had rounded its corners. She turned slowly. where there should have been the back lot of her grandmother's house, its laundry line and sagging lilac. There was meadow. The fence remained. Not wooden, not wire, but a line of air warmer than the air beside it, visible only because the grass on one side leaned toward it, and the grass on the other leaned away. Boundaries could be this gentle, apparently. You just had to ask them nicely. The smaller sounds found her. A persistent tick underfoot. Beetles conducting a tiny parliament at the roots. The low cuff of a distant wave, arriving late and unashamed. Somewhere behind her, a gate latch tapping twice, as if reminding a door how to finish closing without waking the house. The field breathed with her, but now their breaths were not synchronized so much as neighborly, a rhythm you could live beside, without needing to match. She lifted her hand, and the moisture on the grass lifted. 2. The droplets swiveling to regard her like patient eyes. The pause had taught even water manners. Where'd you go? Micah's voice reached her in its new size. Still his, but de-amplified, shorn of the old defensiveness and the newer awe. He emerged from a fold in the field, carrying the cracked radio against his chest like something still learning to sleep. I didn't, she said. Everything else moved to include me. He looked around as if the world had confessed to a lovely crime. I thought there'd be a crater, he said, or scaffolding, or at least a plaque that says a miracle occurred here. Please do not touch the miracle. The radio hummed 3 heartbeats, then rested. He nodded down at it. It's quiet unless I try to make sense of it. Then it warms up like a dog that wants to go outside. Juno smiled. Let it want. They walked. The field offered paths where their feet decided to be. No track led them, but none resisted. The ridge rose at the far edge, not dramatically, just enough to remind knees of their anatomy. Up close, it looked ordinary again. Rock like rock, soil like soil, but the prairie grass carried thin filaments of gold down its stalks, as if sunlight had left threads on its way through. What is this? Micah asked. A middle, she said, where endings go to rest until they admit they never were. They found a tree that was both new and old. The trunk knew a century. The leaves were first day soft. Beneath it, the field gathered itself into a shallow bowl. The bowl held silence the way a good room holds a secret. Carefully, without ownership, Juno sat. The earth received like a couch that had memorized the first posture of grief and the second posture of peace. Micah sat, too, cross-legged, radio on his knee. The sky wore a color developed for the inside of oysters. Do you think it? He began, stopped, gentle with his words. Do you think they are gone? Juno rubbed the heel of her hand against the bone below her eye, the place the old hum had lived. No, she said. I think we stopped needing them to be separate. From town came the low, tasteful thunder of ordinary things resuming, a cart rolling across a threshold, a kettle announcing water with dignity, a screen door keeping a promise to spring. These sounds arrived through the grass, like letters carried by a careful postman. Listen, Juno said, and Micah did, and it was enough. She lay back, staring up through the branches. The leaves had adopted the patience of libraries. Sometimes, when wind moved through them, they made the sound of pages turning. At other times, they made the sound of pages being notated in pencil, in the margin, by a reader who knows the book will outlive them and matches their handwriting to that humility. I expected Aftermath to be louder, Micah said. All my pictures of salvation had trumpets. Maybe we didn't need saving, she said. Maybe we needed sizing. Down! Into. The radio sighed, as if in agreement, and went still. Hours, or minutes measured kindly, passed. Bees practiced scales nearer ear, choosing a key with no anxiety. Ants walked around her boot, without disputing jurisdiction. A crow flew over, a sentence of feathers concluding politely on the far fence of air. Then the field lifted a seam and Janine stepped through, apron wrinkled, cheeks flushed from work that didn't demand explanation. She carried a thermos and 3 cups. I poured the coffee before remembering I didn't need to, she said, pouring anyway. Habit outran miracle. Happens. They drank. The coffee tasted like itself. Juno loved it with a clarity that felt medicinal. I was washing the diner windows this morning, Janine said, and the glass showed me the ridge, but not like a news report, more like a cousin. familiar and unremarkable, carrying something heavy in both hands like it always does. She glanced toward town. Nobody wants to be interviewed. They want to sweep. It's a relief. Micah smiled. And your keys? Janine lifted them from her pocket. The metal gleamed a decent gray. Regular again, she said. They like the singing, but they like opening better. They sat. The day lengthened without the ache of effort. The sun moved not obediently, but responsibly, sliding toward a horizon that now knew its job, to hold endings without pretending to be one. Children's voices stitched themselves along the meadow's edge, the seam precise and loose at once. A boy carrying a jar held it up to the light. The jar held nothing. He twisted the lid anyway, confident he was preserving a valuable emptiness. A girl with a plastic recorder put the instrument to her lips and produced 3 notes that nearly made a melody and absolutely made a point. Somewhere close, a lawn sprinkler ticked. Efficient rain with a work ethic. Juno felt the field adjust under her shoulder blade. The adjustment carried a picture, there, then gone, of her grandmother threading a needle without looking, trusting her hands to read the small, either way they read recipes in grief. The picture warmed the back of Juno's throat. She swallowed it the way you swallow medicine that's been waiting for your throat to be the right size. Do you miss it? Micah asked. The big sound. I miss how brave it made everyone, she said. But I don't miss the reason we needed bravery. He nodded, staring at the radio. I keep thinking about when it said, we only want to be heard once. That word, once. It sounded like a limit, but now it feels like an agreement. Like a wedding vow that includes letting go. Janine said, we heard them. They heard us. None of us owe fireworks. A wind crossed the field with the manners of a guest drying plates with a good towel. The grass lay down where it passed, then stood again, unoffended. Juno closed her eyes and saw the counting rooms in the fog, each alcove holding an ordinary thing willing to keep being ordinary. The spool, the teacup, the pencil. She realized she could visit them without leaving the field. The door to that corridor had moved from the ridge to the rib cage. What now? Micah asked, not pleading, planning. Practice, Juno said. Of what? Pauses, Janine answered, and of answers that are small enough to keep. They didn't decide together, but they decided together. At dusk, each night, the town would meet wherever they already were and breathe to the same count. 4, 3, 2, 1, and the generous pause that makes an argument into a conversation. No speeches. No chairs arranged in defensive circles. Just a pause shared so the rest of the day could organize itself around something tender. Word passed through needlepoint without phones. The decision wore no name but picked up habits. Porch lights dimming not as code but as courtesies. Dogs pausing mid-bark because they could. Music turned down but not off because joy is allowed to whisper. As the afternoon rested his hand on the field's shoulder, a man from the cannery arrived with a shovel and a plank of cedar. He looked at the ground as a person looks at a piano. They've promised to learn. Want to help? He asked, and all 3 did, which felt like finding seat belts you'd forgotten existed. They dug a shallow trench and set the plank on 2 flat stones. The board smelled like privacy. Juno ran her hand along the grain. The wood had kept the river's math. You could tell. What is it? Micah asked. A place for leaving, the man said, and a place for not taking. He set a pencil on the plank, then stepped back. If you have something heavy you never meant to keep, he shrugged, let the field remember it, so you don't have to. Janine set down the postcard she'd been carrying in her apron pocket for 6 years. No stamp, no address. A picture of a lighthouse with a sky too proud. It was supposed to be an apology, she said. It turned into a leash. She put her hand on the wood. No more. Micah took from his jacket a fuse wrapped in paper, the kind that saves machine with fire. I've been carrying this since the night the lights went wrong, he said. Keeps me honest, keeps me afraid. He laid it down with the care one gives a sleeping animal. Juno had nothing in her pockets but lint that smelled like old citrus and new coffee. She looked at her hands, then, without drama, removed the thin, invisible thread tied around her left ring finger. She had tied it the day her grandmother died and never untied it for fear of proving death accurate. The thread fell onto the plank and did not break the air. The field accepted it with a mercy of shade. The man from a cannery nodded, satisfied, and left them to it. He walked away whistling the kind of song that doesn't make a point and therefore lands one. Evening sideways then. The sun, finally willing to leave, negotiated a dignified exit with the ridge. The ridge allowed. Shadows shortened into themselves like well-trained dogs, then lengthened toward the houses, then became rooms. The field took on the color of promises kept privately. People came, not by summons but by habit, and paused at the plank long enough to practice the difference between release and performance. A woman placed a brass button and the memory of a sentence she'd almost spoken yesterday. A boy contributed the lid of an empty jar and grinned without embarrassment. An old man laid down a photograph and then took up again and then laid down instead the grip he'd been keeping on the person in it. When the light had thinned enough to show stars, Juno stood again. The field had become the town's new porch. The ridge had become the town's new patience. The harbor breathed the town's new tempo. None of this needed blessing, so all of it felt blessed. Micah lifted the radio, thumbed along its spine like a reader saving a page. "Do we turn it on?" he asked. "Only if we're ready to be wrong," Juno said. He rotated the dial the width of a breath. A small tone answered, neither urgent nor coy. It presented itself the way a stranger offers a name at a party, without adding a job or a claim. Yes, Juno told it, though it hadn't asked. "We hear you." The tone folded itself into nothing, which is to say, into everything else. They stood in the field until cold asked them to live indoors again. On the walk back through the meadow, the fence of warm air was still there, delineating without scolding. Juno passed through and felt the smallest tingle along her wrist, as if a friend had squeezed it. "Good night, remember how," and then let go. Her grandmother's house met her at the porch with an economy of light that made the floorboards proud. Inside, the sewing room slept, threads dim under their responsibilities. She opened the window and let the night's slow grammar enter. The tape deck sat on the table, warm from nobody's hand. She pressed record because she wanted to know what the new quiet sounded like when asked to leave evidence. On the tape, breath, yes. A moth against glass. Yes. From down the block, a laugh that traveled like an apology that didn't need to be said and was, anyway, for practice. Then, barely, a voice, not her grandmother's, not the Ridge's, not any one person's. Just a voice that appears when a room is safe enough to hold it. Hold it kindly. It said again, borrowing yesterday's instruction, so today could stand on something steady. Juno stopped the tape. She didn't rewind it. The future could listen to itself. In bed, she lay on her side the way her grandmother had taught her ribs to appreciate. The hum did not return. She didn't want it to. Instead, the smaller sounds assembled into a pact. The floor settling into its story, the radiator considering its character, her lungs agreeing to try again in the morning with what they had. At the edge of sleep, she heard the town take the pause they had promised one another. The pause expanded just enough to make a seat for one more person, then precisely enough to fit the person who had not known they were the one. She smiled into the pillow, without needing an audience for the smile. When she closed her eyes, the field was still there, not under the ridge or instead of it, but within the day's reach. The plank with its modest reliquary of unkept burdens. The air fence drawing a line the way a parent draws a bath, warm, inviting, with the dignity of temperature. Out beyond everything you could point at, something like a ship, but not a ship moved through a geometry that no longer required spectacle to be believed. It did not come closer. It did not go away. It held its note at a volume calibrated to decency. Juno slept. The town slept. The sea kept the beat not as a metronome, but as a witness. And when morning considered its entrance, it rehearsed in a whisper, remembered the lesson of edges, and promised to arrive with a kindness scaled to human throats. For 2 days, or maybe 2 lifetimes, needlepoint existed only as vibration. The town itself was still there, the diner, the harbor, the rusted radio tower, but everything pulsed faintly, as though the world had been sketched on water and forgot how to stay still. Juno sat on the back steps of her grandmother's house with the tape deck balanced on her thighs. The wood beneath her thrummed like a slow drum, each board keeping time with a patience she didn't deserve. The mug beside her saucer concentric ripples without spilling. When she lifted it, the coffee remembered the shape of the cup and held itself together a fraction too long before obeying gravity. Even the moths that worried the porch light moved in delicate loops that seemed less like flight and more like handwriting. Across the yard, the lilacs, bare now and industrious, leaned together in a wind that wasn't wind. Their canes ticked lightly, a metronome for some invisible practice. The fence hummed a fifth above the steps. Somewhere under the kitchen, the old furnace ticked in sympathy, not running, merely agreeing. She pressed her palm flat on the tape deck. The machine was warm, the kind of warmth metal keeps in its bones after a day of weather. No reels turned, no needle quivered. Still it responded to her touch, lowering its vibration, as if to say, I will meet you where you are. From the alley, a cat slid past without noise, shoulders rising and falling with the whole town's breath. Its tail brushed Juno's ankle at the exact moment a gull tilted over the harbor. That was how the days were now. Coincidences reimagined as collaboration. When she finally stood, the world stood with her. The steps released their note. The mug quieted. The moths completed their letters and signed off. Juno walked down a main, the tape deck in the crook of her elbow like a child who had outgrown being carried and forgave you anyway. The diner's bell did not ring when she opened the door. It vibrated instead, a bright, almost voice that found the seam between greeting and respect. Janine looked up from the counter, where she was polishing glasses that no longer needed polishing. The cloth moved in small circles, and the glass returned the favor, shining a little more than physics demanded. Same, Janine asked, and the word same covered a decade and the present instant, and what came next. Same, Juno said. Janine poured. The stream made a note so gentle it might have been ashamed to call itself a note. Juno watched the liquid settle, watched the surface elasticize and then relax, watched steam rise as if receiving permission, not heat. Micah slid into the booth across from her. He seemed both younger and older than he'd been last week, as if the vibration had shaken some age loose and replaced it with better, truer fatigue. He set his cracked radio on the table. The little beast glowed faintly from within, not with power but with attention. They say time and rhythm are cousins, he said. But cousins can go years without speaking and show up to the funeral like they never left. Who's the funeral for? Juno asked. I don't know, he said. I keep thinking, not us. They ate in quiet that wasn't quiet. Forks rang the way forks ring when they like their work. A child in a corner booth practiced pouring ketchup in a perfect circle around her fries. The bottle complied, satisfied to be included in such care. A man at the window wrote a letter, without words, a page of lines and pauses that somehow conveyed everything to the person who would read it later, or not. Outside, the harbor held itself still as a hell breath. The tide learned to wait and loved the discipline. Beyond the breakwater, a line of darker water marked the place where the world remembered to be deep. Above that line, the sky played a chord that only the gulls seemed qualified to adjudicate. They approved by refusing to shout. After breakfast, Juno walked up Cemetery Hill to the radio tower. It had always been a mean thing, iron like a warning, bolts like arguments, but now the rust wore its oranges with dignity. The tower hummed low enough to massage ribs, higher than grief, lower than joy. The guide wires drew taut golden lines through air that had learned how to listen. When wind slid by, the lines sang each other's names. The concrete pad at the tower's base was warm. She sat on it and pressed her back to the metal. The hum rearranged the day into sections, morning with old stories, noon with small repairs, afternoon with making room, evening with practice. She thought of the field where boundaries had gone soft and returned kinder. She thought of the plank for leaving and how it had filled with things that weighed nothing and everything. She thought of her grandmother, who would have liked this new version of the tower, less lighthouse, more tuning fork. Children came up from the schoolyard like a flock of intelligent birds and chalked circles onto the pad, a hopscotch of planets and pauses. They played a game with new rules. You hop on the numbers when the wind sings high. You hop on the spaces when the wind sings low. The chalk decides ties. They didn't ask Juno to move. the chalk, and she agreed on a circle around her feet. That counted as home. Later, she followed the path along the ridge toward the old signal station. The door hung open now, not because anyone had forced it, but because the hinges had decided to forgive the frame. Inside, dust floated in precise patterns, a dance of specks that revealed currents too fine for hands to feel. The dead console blinked once when she touched it, not to imply power, but to acknowledge the courtesy. On the far wall, the gauge that had once trembled between impossible numbers now rested at a mark someone or something had penciled in, "Listen." No units, no scale. The needle leaned against it comfortably. Beneath, in a careful hand that looked very much like her grandmother's, someone had added, "Hold the pause like a cup of hot water. Don't rush the sip." Juno laughed, then cried, then laughed at the tidy engineering of a room that could carry both. When she stepped back outside, she found the town gathered along the ridge as if for a parade the world had not advertised, but everyone had heard marching toward them anyway. No banners, no floats. People brought chairs because chairs are how bodies admit they are worth comfort. Someone had set a table with bread and simple jam. Another rolled up a rug on which 3 toddlers gave a demonstration of humility by falling, standing, and clapping for the floor. The old mechanic tuned a guitar by not tuning it, finding instead the place where it liked to be. Janine carried a jar of buttons and let anyone take one. She said each was good for remembering a task not yet learned. Micah stood beside the little radio as if beside a friend who might choose either to speak or to nap. "We're going to try something," he said without volume, and the whole hill heard him the way a family hears a sigh in a different room. He lifted the radio and turned the dial hair by hair until the speaker brushed against a tone that felt like a seam. The town inhaled together, not rehearsed, not commanded, simply mutual. Juno felt the inhale in the soles of her feet, in the small muscles along her shins, in that thin place on the breastbone where terror and wonder divide the rent, and both live there peacefully if paid on time. The radio gave him a note the size of a hand on his shoulder, not instruction. Inclusion. People began to answer in small ways. A woman hummed into her scarf, as if lending warmth to cloth. A boy tapped the zipper of his jacket against his teeth in a pattern that sounded like hello if you had ever been lonely. 2 men in work boots stood with their hats in their hands. Not like mourners, like neighbors who know how to share the weather. The sound they made together didn't rise or build. It wove. Juno opened the tape deck and set it on the ground in the place where the grass had learned to be a microphone. She pressed record and immediately forgot that she had. Proof of luxury, not a mission. The vibration of the next hours, minutes, years, who would quarrel with names, was less performance than calibration. People found each other's volumes. Babies discovered the moral perfection of squealing exactly once. Dogs practiced not barking and were praised for the restraint with a treat that tasted like duty properly done. The wind negotiated with the tower, and the tower yielded and the wind felt honored. A storm approached from the sea, not with thunder, but with the confidence of a competent letter. Its clouds were paragraphs, its gusts enclosures. The first drops arrived, and everyone tilted their faces up at the same time. Rain laid fingers on the radio, and the radio replied by humming just enough to keep itself company. The tape deck sang a little, because everything did. Afterward, people left the hill with the casual efficiency of a congregation that has decided the service counts only if it makes the afternoon kinder. They took their chairs, their crumbs, their buttons. The rug left a print in the grass shaped like patience. The ridge remained. Juno and Micah lingered, as people who have been surprised by relief often do. They walked down by the cannery where the corrugated walls carried a lower resonance that made knees honest. Along the loading dock, they found a crate turned into a bench and sat. The crate had once carried pears. It remembered the shape of their kindness and smelled faintly of sweetness offered to bruises. "Do you feel it?" Micah asked. "The vibration? The fact that it's willing to be small." She nodded. "It trusts us with the volume knob." "Do we deserve that?" "No," she said and smiled. "That's why it's mercy." They watched the bay. A tug pushed a barge that was really a mirror with ambition. The wake drew a white line that the gulls read as punctuation and obeyed. Down the street, someone tuned a piano with the same humility the ridge showed. Not to perfection, to belonging. Night came softly, a shawl laid over her lap. The town practiced, ending its day without clocks scolding or schedules bragging. Porch lights dimmed themselves to gentle. A boy begged to stay out until the dark got darker, and was told yes because trust is a good leash. The radio tower, once a geometry of warning, shimmered a brief, invisible color that Juno felt in the joint of her jaw and nowhere else. She returned to the house. The sewing room greeted her with a dignity, with reserves for those who have apologized. The threads lay calm. The typography slept. She opened the window, and the night entered as if it knew the room already. Somewhere on the street, a bicycle ticked as it cooled. Somewhere not on the street, a wave completed its sentence and started another. Juno rewound the tape. She did not press play yet. She sat on the floorboards with her back against the bed and let the vibration move through the lumber and into the spine that had learned its lesson. When she finally pressed the triangle, the speakers released a sound like rain on a metal roof from far away. Under that, her grandmother's voice, not new, not old, saying a phrase that had become the town's quiet creed. Hold it kindly. The reels turned a little, then slowed, then stopped on their own. Morning again, or its cousin. She walked to the field that shouldn't have existed, and found the plank of cedar resting on its stones. People had been there. The pencil now wore teeth marks from someone who had needed a small, permissible destruction. The brass button had been replaced by a paperclip shaped into a heart without irony. The fuse lay where Micah had set it, pale as a confession grown up into responsibility. Juno added nothing. She placed her hand on the wood and let it take a copy of her pulse to file under current. When she looked up, the ridge was there, and the town, and the sky, and the water, all quivering less than yesterday, as if the world were settling a quilt over sleeping bodies, and deciding it would be safe to leave the room. You could call it calm. You could call it truce. Juno called it craft. The vibration did not leave. It learned to trade. It ran the length of telephone wires, delivering news the way veins deliver. With tact, it moved through stovepipes and reminded Stu to be tender. It tapped the edges of photographs and gave faces permission to be remembered without ache. It made the air around pianos patient with students. It met the ground under beds and promised nightmares there would be less work for them now. On the second night, lifetime, Juno stood by her grandmother's fence and breathed with the town. Not exactly together, but together enough. Micah lifted the radio and let it rest at his side, turned off and utterly useful. Janine, on her porch, held her keys in her pocket, like a prayer said for someone who didn't ask. The tower on the hill kept its place. The harbor kept its volume. The gulls slept with their heads tucked like commas. It occurred to Juno, not as thought but as phrasing that found a home. Vibration is just another word for presence that refuses to solidify out of kindness. She closed her eyes, and the town continued to exist as vibration, and also as itself, boards and bolts and breath. The 2 days, lifetimes, folded along their seam and made a book thick enough to press flowers in later. In the morning, edges would sharpen a little more, and the world would pretend to be ordinary with such excellence that no one would be tempted to correct it. For now, the diner exhaled a minute of cinnamon without source. The harbor turned over once like a sleeper. The radio tower told the wind its name and asked for nothing back. Juno lay down on the floor beside the tape deck and, for the first time since the first light had first spoken, slept like a person who had decided to live where she'd already been living. The town dreamed around her, not one dream, but many, and each vibration took its place as carefully as a cup returned to the right hook in a kitchen that has learned the luxury of quiet. When she woke, there would be toast. There would be sweeping. There would be the small inventory of kindnesses done and not done, balanced without bookkeeping. There would be, most of all, the practice of the pause, which is just a brave thing you do with your breath before you make a sound you intend to keep. At sunrise, the fog returned, not as weather, but as memory deciding to take form again. It did not roll in from the sea this time, nor drift down from the ridge. It simply appeared, blooming from the air itself, gentle and immediate, like the world exhaling everything it had tried too hard to hold. The first light caught it and split it into soft layers of gold and ash. It hung low, tender, deliberate, a presence rather than condition. From her window, Juno watched as the familiar outlines of needlepoint redrew themselves through the haze. The harbor lanterns blinked like eyes reopening after a long meditation. The rooftops shimmered with dew that refused to fall. Even the telephone poles hummed, faintly, politely, acknowledging something unseen passing between them. It wasn't silence that filled the morning, but its refined cousin, stillness, the kind that listens back. Juno dressed quietly, each movement amplified by the house's attentive calm. The floorboards beneath her feet seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if relieved to have a rhythm again. The old mirror near the stairs held no reflection, only light waiting for her to walk through it. When she stepped outside, the fog wrapped around her, neither cold nor wet, a second skin that carried her heartbeat outward until it met the town's. The ridge loomed barely visible, a suggestion rather than a shape. Its golden veins were gone, yet Juno felt them pulsing beneath everything. Under the gravel, the fences, the roots of the trees. The hum had evolved again. It wasn't sound anymore. It was comprehension, a frequency too compassionate to be heard, but too alive to vanish. Down on Main Street, life had resumed, though life had learned new manners. Janine's diner was open, but the sign didn't buzz. Instead, the glass windows glowed faintly with the warmth of coffee already brewed. People spoke in tones that didn't cut through the air but settled into it, like pebbles finding their place at the bottom of a stream. The whole town moved, as if remembering choreography from a dream. Micah waved from across the street. He had traded his cracked radio for a notebook, its pages rippling faintly with the humidity. "It's back," he said, joining her on the curb. "The fog." He shook his head. The in-between. They stood in quiet agreement. In needlepoint, words had become the least efficient way to communicate. The fog around them shimmered with soft color, not light exactly, but emotion rendered visible, a muted aurora expressing what the heart refused to ruin with grammar. "I think," Micah began, "it's not here to stay. It's visiting," like an echo that came back to see who was still listening. Juno smiled faintly. "Then we should listen properly." The two of them began walking toward the harbor. The fog deepened as they moved, closing around them like an unfinished sentence. The ground beneath their feet vibrated with an even pulse, neither heartbeat nor tide, but something between the two. When Juno spoke again, the air seemed to lean closer. "Do you ever think," she said softly, "that it was never trying to warn us? That maybe it just wanted to remember with us?" Micah nodded, his voice barely a thread. It never felt angry, just lonely. The dock appeared like a memory surfacing. Boards slick with mist, ropes curled in precise spirals, boats tethered but weightless in the calm tide. The water was perfectly still, a mirror with its eyes closed. Juno leaned over the edge. Beneath the surface, faint streaks of gold moved slowly, like veins on the translucent skin. "The hum's still here," she whispered. "Just quieter." Micah crouched beside her. "It's doing what we should have done all along, resting." For a moment, the horizon brightened. The sun, diffused by the fog, spread itself thin across the sea like an artist testing color on paper. The light didn't pierce. It soothed. In it, every shape, boat, rope, wave, reflection, seemed to forgive its outline. Juno took the tape deck from her satchel and set it gently on the planks. Its surface was clean, but inside, she could still feel the ghost warmth of every hum it had ever captured. She pressed record, though she doubted anything would answer. For a long while, there was only the sound of fog rearranging itself, the subtle rustle of memory folding and refolding to make room for new thought. Then came something small, a tone, almost a sigh, like a child whispering to keep from waking the world. Juno froze. The sound repeated, clearer now, shaping itself into rhythm. 4, 3, 2, 1, pause. The count they'd learned, the breath they'd shared, the universal pause between chaos and understanding. Micah reached for her arm. "It's them," he said quietly. But Juno shook her head. "No, it's us. It's just us, remembering how to be answered." The tape deck vibrated once and stopped. The fog thinned, not retreating, but dissolving, like sugar stirred into warm milk. It became invisible, but its presence remained softer, woven into the texture of the air. All around them, Needlepoint was waking again. A door opened. A kettle hissed. Someone laughed, the sound bright and ordinary and miraculous. The vibration that had once ruled the town now pulsed gently beneath its skin. Not command, not control, just communion. Micah looked out at the sea. "Do you think it's over?" Juno considered the question, her gaze tracing the faint gold in the water, the ghost of light still clinging to the waves. "No," she said finally. "I think it's understood." The word lingered, and in the lingering became something else, a bridge between silence and gratitude. They walked back up the hill in companionable quiet. The houses appeared sharper as the fog receded. The white of paint more sincere, the glass in windows clearer, the wood grain on porches deeper. But beneath every color was that same faint hum, that same pulse that refused to leave entirely, a low, living thread running through everything. When they reached the edge of town, they found Janine outside her diner, hanging a hand-painted sign that read, "Open for quiet." She grinned at them. "Figured that's what we do best now." Inside, the coffee was hot, the bread soft, the world alive in small ways. People spoke less, but every word carried the weight of having been chosen. A spoon clinked against a cup and sounded like a bell. The radio on the shelf emitted a single tone, gentle, approving, and then went silent again as if satisfied with the state of things. That night, Juno stood by her window. The fog had gone, but the air still shimmered faintly. Not with light, but with listening. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a single gull cried once and then stopped, as if remembering it didn't need to prove its existence anymore. She pressed her hand against the glass. It was warm. The heartbeat she felt through it wasn't hers alone. For the first time in longer than she could measure, the world didn't seem to be asking for anything. It was simply present, content in the company of its own echo. The fog, she realized, hadn't returned to remind them. It had returned to join them, a visitor settling in beside its host, ready at last to rest. And as the last light of dawn spread across the harbor, neither gold nor white nor any color known to paint, Needlepoint exhaled, not as a place ending, but as a memory choosing to continue. The town vibrated once more, not in fear, not in grief, but in peace. The kind of vibration that comes when a song finishes exactly where it was always meant to. The tide rolled in without sound. No foam, no crash, only motion, the kind of slow, deliberate movement that made it unclear who was pulling whom, the sea or the shore. It came in folds, patient and lucid, as though it had finally remembered how to walk barefoot. The water brushed the rocks with care, pausing after each small advance, like someone testing forgiveness. There was no wind, no gulls. The air itself seemed to hesitate, unsure if it was meant to belong to sky or to water. Juno stood at the edge of the pier, shoes half submerged, the cuffs of her jeans dark with salt. The ocean did not sting. It acknowledged. Every ripple was warm to the touch, a strange, gentle warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. It was recognition, physicalized. She looked down and saw her reflection, but it no longer mimicked her perfectly. It breathed when she didn't, blinked when she watched too closely, tilted its head slightly toward the horizon, as if trying to show her where to look. Micah was sitting on the post behind her, radio in hand. The once cracked device now glowed faintly from within, steady and even, like it found the right frequency, and decided not to leave it. "It's not broadcasting anymore," he said, voice soft enough not to startle the air. "It's harmonizing, like it knows the tide's key." Juno didn't turn. "What key is that?" He smiled, half awake, half worshipful, something between memory and breath. They stayed that way for a while, watching the horizon fail to divide the world. The line where sky met water pulsed faintly gold, like the seam of a wound learning it could close without scarring. There was no sunrise yet, but the light was already there, not overhead, not behind, but inside everything. The town of Needlepoint stretched behind them, ghostly and kind in the half-light. The rooftops shimmered with dew that refused to evaporate. Curtains moved as though touched by invisible hands, careful, respectful. The hum that once haunted every object had settled now into a rhythm beneath the threshold of hearing. It wasn't gone. It had simply decided to live quietly, inside the pulse of things. A heron glided low over the harbor, its wings never touching air so much as negotiating with it. When it landed on a piling near Juno, the ripples that spread outward were symmetrical, geometric, precise, the same pattern she had once seen stitched into her grandmother's glowing web of golden thread. She crouched and dipped her hand into the water. Beneath her fingers, the tide trembled once, then steadied, aligning itself with her pulse. A faint light followed the motion, tracing her reflection's outline like a signature. "It's remembering us," she whispered. Micah leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Maybe it always did. Maybe we were the ones who forgot to remember back. From the corner of her vision, she saw the harbor's old radar tower blink once. Faint but deliberate, its beam no longer scanned the horizon. It rotated lazily in place, content to measure the quiet instead of the distance. The tide climbed higher, spilling gently over the pier's edge and across the cobblestones that led into town. The water didn't flood, it visited. Every drop seemed to know where it was allowed to go. The front steps of the diner glistened, the reflection of Janine's open for quiet sign swaying on the surface, like a lullaby for buildings. Janine herself stepped into the doorway, apron tied, holding a steaming mug that somehow did not steam. "It's come back," she said simply. Juno nodded, not to stay, just to check the heartbeat. Janine smiled faintly. "It'll find it steady." As the water reached the first row of houses, something extraordinary happened. The reflections in the tide didn't just mirror the buildings. They amended them. Cracks vanished. Missing shutters reappeared. Paint brightened a few shades, matching its memory rather than its present. Even the harbor lamps seemed taller, their glass polished by recollection itself. Micah watched, eyes wide. "It's restoring the idea of things. The way a memory forgives detail," Juno said. He looked at her. "And you think it'll stop?" She considered the question for a long moment. Not stop. Settle, like music after the last chord. Out on the horizon, the water changed color, a deep, slow gold that didn't reflect sunlight but made it. From within the tide, something vast was shifting, but it wasn't a creature. It was movement itself learning to breathe. The whole bay shimmered, as if exhaling centuries. Micah's radio vibrated once, not with static but with resonance, the same pulse that now ran to the tide, the ground, and the space between words. A soft voice emerged from it, neither male nor female, human nor not. It was clear, like air over glass. You carried the silence well. The words rippled through them, bypassing the ear entirely, spoken directly into the part of the body that beats. Juno closed her eyes. "We tried to listen." "And you did," the voice said, but listening was never the test. Staying was. The tide rose once more, brushing against their ankles with the gentleness of a benediction. It wasn't wet anymore, just warm, humming faintly, as if every molecule had learned the same language and was whispering it through touch. Janine stepped off the diner porch, barefoot, the hem of her apron soaking gold where it met the water. Behind her, others emerged from their doorways, men, women, children, their faces calm, unstartled. The sea reached for them, not to pull them in, but to meet them halfway. All across the harbor, reflections moved independently of the people above them, each shadow self tilting its head in greeting before merging slowly, like breath meeting its echo. The voice spoke again, quieter now. "The tide has no end, only continuations. You remembered the rhythm. We remember the rest." Juno felt tears slip down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from recognition, the deep, cellular kind that precedes all thought. She turned to Micah, who was already nodding, as though hearing the same thing. "I think it's finishing," he said. "No," Juno corrected softly. "It's beginning where we finally stopped interrupting." The fog over the sea thinned just enough to reveal the horizon's secret. Faint geometries rising and falling, enormous patterns of light moving in rhythm with the tide. They were neither ships nor stars. They were the architecture of memory itself, turning in slow unison like planets in forgotten orbit. The hum deepened once, vibrating through every grain of air. Then silence. But it wasn't the empty kind. It was the kind that happens when every question has already been answered, and the only sound left is the world practicing gratitude. The tide stopped climbing. It lingered around their feet for a moment, pulsing softly, then began to retreat, not withdrawing, but returning home. As it went, it left behind perfect stillness. No foam, no residue, only the faint shimmer of golden light clinging to the stones like breath on glass. Janine placed her hand on Juno's shoulder. "Think it'll come again?" Juno smiled. "I think it never left." The three of them stood watching the last of the tide dissolve back into the horizon. The air was different now, weightless, balanced, aware. A kind of peace that didn't demand recognition, but offered it freely. When they finally turned to walk home, their footprints glowed faintly for a few seconds, each step leaving behind a soft echo that pulsed once, twice, then disappeared. And as Juno reached the top of the hill, the dawn finally broke, not above her, but through her. The world exhaled, the sea listened, and the silence, patient as ever, began to hum again, this time from within every living thing, steady and eternal, like the sound of the tide dreaming itself back to shore. By the 20th day since the lights first appeared, Needle Point had become an echo of itself, a town half remembered by the land that carried it. Birds returned, but they flew lower, tracing invisible spirals over the ridge, as if mapping the heartbeat that still pulsed there. They didn't call much. Their wings stitched quiet seams through the morning, as though sound now required a visa, and they weren't sure of the paperwork. The harbor wore its calm like a well-washed shirt. Porch steps relearned the way to feet. The radio tower on Cemetery Hill no longer hunted horizons. It regarded the in-between, satisfied to measure patience. Juno and Micah spent their mornings in silence, writing down what they could remember before memory reshaped itself again. The habit began as an insurance policy, proof to show themselves when the world put its furniture back, but soon became a liturgy. They wrote at the same kitchen table, where Juno's grandmother had stitched hems and mended arguments. Words, however, resisted them. Each time Juno wrote Ridge, the ink bled into bridge as if language had grown ethical and refused to record separation without offering passage. Each time she tried light, it spread across the page until it became listen, the letters widening like a mouth that preferred hearing to speaking. Micah's notebook collected misbehaving nouns, too. Tower softened to toward. Harbor lengthened into harboring. Time kept rearranging into tune. On the second day of this ritual, Janine arrived with bread still warm from the oven and a pad of order slips salvaged from the diner's quieter era. "Use these," she said, setting them between the notebooks. They were designed to remember hunger. When Juno wrote on them, the paper behaved, no bleeding, no pious corrections, only the honest creak of pencil against pulp. It felt right that memory preferred humble forms. They cataloged small phenomena with the reverence of botanists, how reflections had returned but now bowed before faces instead of arguing with them, how the fog came only when invited by open windows, how the sea occasionally raised one wave in greeting and then resumed its steady, charitable work. They noted the town's new customs, the dusk pause on porches, the plank in the field where residents left unmeant burdens, the way dogs listened to the wind and chose not to disagree with it. They wrote the recipe for the town's breath for 3, 2, 1, hold kindly, and below it Juno penciled a warning she had learned from Ridge: do not force the pause, let it volunteer. On the 7th morning, the hum began again, faint, measured, intimate. It didn't come from above or below, but from between. The bowl of the room answered. The spoon on the saucer replied. The air shimmered, and the sunlight fractured into golden dust, hanging midair like suspended breath. The dust did not fall. It loosened itself from gravity's grammar, and waited like the last snow reluctant to accept spring. Micah turned to her. "It's choosing." "Choosing what?" Juno asked, though a part of her knew, which parts of us to keep. Juno felt it too, a pulling sensation, not painful, more like being sorted by the things she'd loved and forgotten. Every kindness, every silence, every unspoken thought vibrated like glass touched by a perfect pitch. She could feel places inside her body lighting. The spot behind her sternum where lullabies live, the length of spine that learned stances from grief, the old knot in her throat that had finally learned to breathe through. Memory was not being erased. It was being curated. Outside, the day laid a hand over the ridge. The grass along the slope brightened at individual blades, not as a field, as if the light had become ethical and was going around the room learning names. Juno stepped onto the porch. The dust followed with the loyalty of a dog that knows the walk is for the human. The ridge glowed once more, lines of light spreading outward in concentric rings. But this time, the glow didn't reach upward. It sank into the sea, the soil, the bones of the earth itself. The pattern looked like snowfall, remembering it was a river. It found the old seams, storm drains, root paths, veinlets of iron, the clay that had kept secret since the town was a promise and a tent. The glow threaded through them with the tenderness of a midwife. No spectacle, only completion. Balance restored. The voice murmured through the hum. It spoke not to their ears, but to the room where recognition sleeps. Sound carried. Juno fell to her knees, the ground warm beneath her palms. The light wasn't gone. It had simply gone inward. She could feel it in the dirt, in the air, in the pulse of her own blood. Her heart footnoted each beat with gratitude. She pressed her fingers to the earth and felt, as clearly as if it were a door she could open with a key, the feel that shouldn't have existed. The cedar plank resting on its stones, the pencil with new teeth marks, the thread she placed there untying itself into usefulness. The town was keeping what it meant. The world was keeping what it could shoulder. Micah stood behind her, whispering as though afraid the silence might start listening again. What if it never left? Juno smiled faintly. Then maybe it never meant to. Above them, the sky dimmed, not dark, but thoughtful, as if considering what to do with its new inheritance. Clouds did not gather. They reflected, trying on colors. Pewter, softened cobalt, a white that remembered milk and forgiveness. The last of the golden dust drifted upward, disappearing into blue like embers deciding to be stars later. The fog that had learned manners sat at the edge of town, like an elderly aunt who knows she is welcome and will not overstay. In the diner, cups clinked. The bell vibrated rather than rang. Janine rode open for quiet again, not because the sign needed refreshing, but because the brush liked being a small instrument of the truth. People sat without the urge to own their chairs. Conversation was careful without being fragile. The radio on the shelf pulsed once and went still, the minimal applause a machine gives when it recognizes a room's good tuning. Needlepoint breathed once, long and slow. The sound that had once held the world together became something else entirely. Memory, but not the brittle museum kind. Memory as an atmosphere, breathable, carrying scents and the shapes of voices, and the angle of a hand at a kitchen table. And memory, at last, learned how to rest. Rest did not mean sleep. It meant not having perform proof. The ridge no longer needed to glow to be believed. The harbor did not have to raise itself to be recognized. Doors could close without commentary. Babies could cry without prophecy. The town adjusted to this new middle-aged miracle with practical affection. At the school, morning announcements were replaced by a taut silence in which pencils arranged themselves on desks as if admitting their responsibility. In the cannery, men took their hats off not in deference to rules, but to give their eyes a little more sky to carry. The church left its doors open but removed the signboard with the sermon titles. The pastor had begun teaching people how to breathe instead. 4 in the pause, 4 in the pause, until the congregation learned that most prayers are already in the lungs and only need escort. Juno and Micah kept writing. Their notebooks stopped arguing with them. Words behaved when spoken with the humility of witnesses. Ridge stayed ridge, but now carried a small footnote. Bridge and potential. Light stayed light, but shaded toward listen when the sentence required mercy. They added drawings, too. The path from house to field rendered as a line that thickened at the places where feet chose to slow. A map of the harbor's new courtesy currents. The radio tower with its wires sketched as harp strings. On the 19th evening, they walked to the field. The fence of warm air still delineated without forbidding. They stepped through and felt that friendly brush along the wrists, not a gate, an invitation. The plank on its stones had acquired new offerings that weighed nothing and changed everything. A grocery list that said milk, eggs, called Dad and had finally done the last thing. a button with no garment, a cheap ring left by someone who understood that promises turn into cages when they outlive consent, a small, carefully folded paper boat with no ink on it at all. They did not add anything that night. They sat and watched the town's breath take its dust measure. Across the meadow, the ridge wore its new face. Not the silver spectacle, not the gold of confession, but the matte kindness of a thing willing to be ordinary after proving it didn't have to be. In the half-light, children practiced a game that hadn't existed a month ago. They arranged stones in a spiral and learned a rule that was not a rule. You may step inside only when you can do so without forcing the stones to notice you. The spiral held. The children learned. An old man with hands permanently stained by oil watched and smiled the way a person smiles when a machine starts on the first turn after winter. On the 20th morning, birds drew those low spirals over the ridge again, mapping, calibrating, approving. Juno woke before their circles were complete and stood at her grandmother's sink. She could feel the hum's softer cousin in the porcelain. The way a basin inherits all the water it has ever held and returns a favor by being patient with the next cup. She poured coffee and did not hurry her first sip. The cup warmed her hands. Her hands warmed the cup. Neither insisted on being the benefactor. Micah knocked once and entered without waiting, because invitations were now assumed among the faithful. He carried a roll of paper under his arm. "I think we should write it down differently," he said. "Differently than how?" "Not a story. A score." They cleared the table and unrolled the paper across it. The blankness looked eager rather than hungry. Micah drew 5 lines like a harbor draws tide marks. Juno began to notate the last weeks without lyrics. Long rests, whole notes labeled with the names of streets, breath marks where the town had decided to stop talking and stand beside its own sound. The ridge's opening became a fermata, the long hold. The field's fence, a soft repeat sign. The plank, a quiet cadenza in which soloists could lay down burdens too melodic for speech. Janine arrived mid-morning with a brown bag and left at the door, a delivery of breakfast without ceremony, and watched from the porch, smiling the smile of someone who knows a kitchen has found its real work again. The pages filled. Where words had bled or behaved sanctimoniously, notation carried modest genius, a language that respected the engine and spared the ego. They titled it not with certainty, but with an address. Needlepoint, after listening. By noon, the hum in the air had softened to a texture, like the difference between cloth and linen. The sky, which had been thoughtful, got to work at being blue again, but was a blue that had learned context and carried, deep in it, a vein of the gold it owed. Along the harbor, men taught boys to tie knots with a new caveat. Tie it so it holds, then tie it so it can be untied. The difference between security and generosity is a layer of breath. People went about their work with unsensational excellence. A woman patched a tire and then sat for 3 minutes because sitting had become as honorable as wrenching. A teenager rewired a lamp and left a coil of extra line in the base for whoever would take it apart years from now. Charity for future hands. The postman took a new route that placed a steep hill near the beginning rather than the end. He wanted his breath where it could be of use to him. Later, walking the beach, Juno and Micah found objects the tide had returned. A jar without label. The glues go still in rings. A watch with no hands that nevertheless remembered noon by warming. A child's shoe that had learned to let water in and out without drowning. They set the objects on a rock and left them for the correct owner, who might be the town or time or a single gull with taste. The air thickened briefly, the way a room thickens when someone is about to tell a story that doesn't need to be told. Juno felt the selecting again, a soft sifting in the chest, as if an archivist had come to tidy shelves she hadn't realized were in disarray. When it passed, she could remember the lights with the accuracy of weather, where she'd been standing, how the fog had changed temperature, how her grandmother's voice had entered a room that had no door. But she no longer needed to take the memory's pulse every hour to confirm it lived. It lived. It had moved in. It washed its cup. In the afternoon, a new sound arrived, hammer on nail. 2 houses over, a porch step had surrendered. 3 neighbors repaired it with minimal leadership and excessive competence. Each strike landed in time with the town's now secret count. The board settled, and everyone there touched it once the way people touch a coffin, and a baby for similar, opposite reasons. Twilight returned like a sentence that prefers the period to the exclamation point. The ridge kept its privacy. The tower played host to a wind that had come to practice scales. The harbor performed its slow, credible miracle of holding boats and not judging their destinations. On porches, people breathed on four and held a pause kindly. The pause passed cups from hand to hand. No one announced. No one logged. Children asked questions and were answered with stories that ended before the moral could embarrass the truth. That night, Juno dreamed, not of the lights, not of rectangles or golden veins, not of voices assembled from weather, but of the town sweeping itself. Brooms moved under their own wisdom. Dust chose the door. Rugs went outside and beat themselves against posts, then apologized to the posts and were forgiven. She woke with the clean tiredness that comes after the right work. In the last light of the 20th day, she walked alone to the ridge. The field welcomed her with the warm, cool air that had learned to draw a boundary without a wound. At the plank, she found just one new item. The word sorry written in pencil, then erased, the dent of the graphite still visible. She pressed her palm to it and felt the dent rise slightly, as if it would want to carry a bit more of the pressure. She whispered thank you to the plank, and meant the field, and meant the town, and meant the parts of herself that had stopped auditioning for a role she already had. On the ridge, she sat where she had knelt during the opening and closing and opening again. The soil no longer warmed with spectacle. It shared the day's accumulated heat like a good bench. She closed her eyes and listened past listening. No hum, no command, only the residual chord in the bones that a room holds after the choir has gone home. It wasn't emptiness. It was capacity. Footsteps approached with the courtesy of someone who had learned to walk in a house at night. Micah sat beside her. They said nothing for the time it takes to recognize that saying nothing together is an accomplishment. He held up the score they'd written. Between the staves, he'd penciled a small instruction. Leave space for the part you can't hear yet. That's the whole thing, Juno said. The whole town. He nodded. I thought about adding a coda. We already did, she said. It's called staying. Above them, the sky dimmed again, thoughtful, not sad. Birds made one last low spiral and settled. The first star did its modest work. You could say the hum had become memory. You could say memory had learned to rest. But the better truth was simpler and less proud. The world had remembered how to keep its own company, and in that keeping had made better room for theirs. Somewhere in the distance a child laughed, the precise laugh of a discovered penny. Somewhere closer a door clicked shut with the sound of a vow renewed without speech. The harbor put its arm around the boats. The ridge rolled its shoulders and slept without watchmen. And in a kitchen with a window that faced both field and road, Juno's taped deck warmed the air by existing and did not move. It did not need to. The story could be played back. It did not require replay. The town would go on being the score, the choir, the quiet. The lights, now gone inward, would illuminate from under, like coals after a feast, like faith that stops advertising and keeps feeding. In the morning, call it the 21st, call it the first, needlepoint would open its doors to the ordinary with the kind of reverence usually reserved for angels. Janine would hang a sign that no longer needed words. Micah would repair a radio that no longer needed reception. Juno would find that when she wrote ridge, it stayed ridge, and when she wrote light, it stayed light, because she was ready to keep both as they were, without asking them to become lessons. And the lamb that carried the town would hum quietly to itself the way a satisfied body does beneath a hand, balance restored, sound carried, pause held, day received, night kept, memory, resting, would not sleep. It would set the table. It would lay out the pencils. It would open the window to air that knew the choreography. It would leave the chair pulled out just an inch in case anyone needed to sit, breathe on for, and join. It began with rain that didn't sound like rain. The drops fell in rhythm, deliberate, patient, as though the sky were playing forgotten song through water. There was structure to it, a cadence, the kind of rain that understood pauses. Each drop hit the earth with soft percussion, and for the smallest fraction of a second, shimmered faintly gold before vanishing into the soil, as if returning home rather than being absorbed. Juno stood in her grandmother's garden, bareheaded, her hair plastered to her temples. Around her, the garden seemed to breathe, The tomatoes gleamed with wet light. The lavender bowed in slow reverence. Every leaf seemed to be listening. The earth didn't just drink the rain. It accepted it gratefully, like correspondence finally answered after years of waiting. The hum had been silent for days, but silence was never emptiness anymore. The air carried its echo in a new form, a residue of vibration that lived in her bones. It was subtle and familiar, like remembering a melody without words, or catching the scent of something that once made you cry for reasons you can't explain anymore. It wasn't haunting her. It was accompanying her. The ridge no longer glowed, yet when Juno's eyes lingered too long on its line against the horizon, she could still detect faint threads pulsing beneath the surface, like veins under translucent skin, moving at a speed just slow enough to make her wonder if she was imagining it. Needlepoint had returned to its rhythms. Coffee poured at the diner. Gulls circled the harbor, doors opened and shut with the ease of repetition. But something essential had changed. Everything had tuned itself. The air, the footsteps, even the spaces between words all carried intention. It was as if the town had been rewritten into a softer key. Micah found her near the fence, soaked, mud on his boots, smiling the way one does when the world proves it remembers how to be kind. His coat clung to him like another layer of rain, but his eyes were bright, reflecting the gold from the falling drops. "It's not leaving," he said softly. Juno turned toward him. "What isn't?" "The light," he said. He reached out his hand and caught a raindrop in his palm. It lingered there for an impossible moment, luminous, trembling, before sinking into his skin. "It's learning how to stay." She followed his gaze to the puddles gathering between the garden stones. They mirrored not the clouds, but something deeper, shifting forms of light that drifted like schools of slow, breathing fish beneath the surface. Every reflection seemed to pulse independently, yet together, in a rhythm she couldn't quite name. Juno knelt beside one of the puddles and placed her fingers on the water. It was warm, not just in temperature, but in temperament, receptive, awake. Beneath her touch, she felt it pulse once, twice, then settle into beat of her own heart. "It's listening again," she whispered. Micah nodded, his voice almost lost in the hush between drops. Maybe it always was. The rain grew steadier, falling like applause slowed down. The rhythm was complex now, not random, but composed. It seemed to travel in phrases, repeating and answering itself, each pulse finding a match in the ground's reply. Through it, faint whispers moved, not words, but shapes of intention, curving through the mist and the soil. The sound didn't travel horizontally anymore. It radiated, vertical and deep, threading through the roots and stones into the ridge, and then farther still toward the sea. At the harbor, the water trembled. The tide responded to the rain, as if the drops were cues in a score. Each ring of gold spreading across the surface expanded and merged with another, forming vast ripples that intersected perfectly. Geometry in motion, memory taking form. The townspeople felt it. They didn't panic. They paused. Some stopped mid-step. Others looked upward with that quiet, usually reserved for birth or forgiveness. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. On Church Street, an old man took off his hat and listened. The youngest child in the schoolyard stopped crying, without knowing why. Even the old church bell, frozen for years by rust and neglect, rang once, not from wind nor from hand, from resonance. The sound carried like a ripple of truth, moving through walls and over fields, touching every house, every heartbeat. For a fleeting instant, the world remembered the language it had used before sound was born. And then, for a heartbeat long enough to feel infinite, needlepoint shone, not the blinding gold of the ridge's awakening, but a gentle luminescence from within, as if every surface had decided to glow from the memory of being seen. The light didn't fall from above. It rose from beneath, inhabiting everything alive. Each face reflected it differently. Janine's eyes, calm and resolute. The child's small hand reaching toward the window. Micah's outline blurred by radiance. All illuminated from within, not like candles, but like comprehension. It wasn't divine. It was intimate. The rain fell through it, merging with the glow until neither belonged to sky nor earth. In that shared moment, Juno understood what her grandmother had meant all those years ago. when she said, "The light doesn't arrive. It remembers its way back." The ridge pulsed once. Quietly, respectfully, acknowledgement, not declaration. The lines of light that had once ripped the world open now moved like sighs beneath the soil, subtle, tender, whole. The hum had become something else entirely. Not an event, but a presence. The storm began to thin. The drops fell slower now, each one heavier with meaning. In the fading rain, Juno could hear faint harmonics. Echoes of laughter, prayer, apologies, promises kept and forgotten. It wasn't supernatural. It was a town's memory settling back into its proper key. When the last drop fell, the air smelled of metal and forgiveness. That sharp, clean scent left behind when the world has just told the truth. Juno rose, brushing the wet hair from her face, her fingers trembling not from cold, but from the weight of recognition. The garden around her steamed faintly. The stones were warm to the touch. The puddles still mirrored the drifting gold shapes, but they were slower now, content to fade. She looked toward the sea, which gleamed like an unopened letter, waiting. "If it learned to stay," she said softly, "maybe so can we." Micah smiled, not the kind of smile meant to reassure, but the kind that confirms you both reached the same sentence at the same time. Behind them, the windows of Needlepoint glowed faintly, one by one, like lanterns being relit not by hand, but by recognition. Somewhere far off, a door closed gently. Somewhere nearer, a child laughed once, and the sound carried to the stillness like the smallest act of creation. The wind, the old, familiar wind, stirred the edge of Juno's coat. It caught her words and carried them outward, over the ridge, over the harbor, over the place where the light had once cracked the world open and then sewn it back together. And from that place came an answer, not a thunderclap, not a hum, a single note, clear as breath, resonating long enough to remind her that silence, too, can sing when it feels safe enough. It faded only when it was certain she'd heard it, when it was certain that, this time, she would remember the melody without needing the light. The rain stopped. The world listened. And Needlepoint, glowing softly from its very soil, began again, not as a story retold, but as a promise kept. For the first time since the lights, the ridge didn't hum, didn't shimmer, didn't move. It simply watched. There was a different kind of presence to it now. No longer the pulsing beacon that split night from memory, but something inward, contemplative, almost human in its restraint. The ridge stood as though it were remembering how to exist without announcing itself, how to just be among the living again. Juno could feel it, not with her eyes, not with her ears, but in the small stillness between heartbeats, that thin space where thought and breath hesitate before choosing what to become. It was there, in that sliver of quiet, that she felt the ridge's attention resting, not as surveillance, but as accompaniment. The air around Needlepoint had changed. It was quieter, yes, but not in a way quiet usually means absence. This quiet held. It gathered things. It collected forgotten sounds the way water collects fallen leaves, carefully, without judgment. When the wind did move, it carried no rustle, only weight, like it was full of meaning too dense to translate. She walked down Main Street slowly, hands in her coat pockets. The town had begun to breathe normally again, though the rhythm still carried something sacred in it. The street lamps flickered in unison, their light steady but tender. Past the diner, where the "open for quiet" sign still hung, Janine was wiping the counter though no customer sat inside. She waved without speaking, and Juno waved back, both knowing that speech wasn't needed anymore unless it wanted to be. The hardware store smelled of oil and pine, its door slightly ajar. Inside, motes of dust drifted in the sunlight, like old conversations returning for a last listen. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath Juno's steps, and she thought for a moment that even the boards had learned the language of patience. People were talking again, softly, as though remembering how. Every word was placed with care, as if speech itself were a fragile gift returned to them after long repair. No one shouted. No one hurried. The world had found a lower volume, and seemed unwilling to lose it. The quiet wasn't emptiness now. It was a vessel. Micah joined her near the harbor. He looked different, not older, but thinner around the edges, like someone who had stared at too much light, and now saw through things instead of around them. His eyes, rimmed by sleepless circles, caught what little sunlight there was and reflected it faintly. "They say the tide's breathing," he murmured. Juno nodded, not surprised. "It's been doing that since the rain." "It sounds like—" He trailed off, tilting his head, listening the way one listens to an old song through a wall, like someone counting. Juno closed her eyes and listened too. The water lapped at the docks in perfect intervals, for seconds in, for seconds out. A rhythm built not of nature, but of intention. The boats swayed in precise unison. The ropes creaked on beat. Even the gulls circled in slow arcs, wings catching the air exactly when the tide exhaled. It wasn't performance. It was remembering. The harbor's wooden posts, usually indifferent to everything but salt and decay, now seemed alive with attention. The reflections of clouds moved in loops that never broke their pattern. Somewhere beneath the waves, something was marking time, not commanding, not measuring, just keeping it. Juno took out her tape recorder. The machine had become a relic, its reels frozen, its magnetism spent. Yet when she pressed record, it clicked softly to life. A sound came through the speaker, not a hum, not a voice, just breathing. She frowned, lifted it to her ear. The breath on the tape wasn't external. It was hers. The pulse that followed each inhale matched her own heart, down to the hesitation between beats. The ridge was no longer sending. It was mirroring. Juno felt her throat tighten. "Micah," she said, "I think it's learning to remember like we do." He blinked, brow furrowed. "You mean forgetting?" Juno smiled faintly, a curve of exhaustion and reverence. "Almost." They stood side by side, watching the harbor breathe. The light had softened over the water, the kind of gold that doesn't shine but glows, like a candle left inside a memory. The clouds above began to gather, not dark, not threatening, but incandescent, their edges illuminated by something that wasn't sunlight. The sky looked alive but not awake, restful, perhaps, curious. A faint tremor passed through the air, less sound than texture, like the hush that follows applause. The glow behind the clouds pulsed once, then again, slow as a heartbeat that had found peace. Micah exhaled. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "It's listening." Juno corrected softly. Then the air trembled again, once more, this time stronger. For a heartbeat, Juno thought she heard everything at once. The laughter that had once filled the diner, the crash of a storm long past, her grandmother's voice humming a hymn she hadn't sung in years, the scrape of boots on the dock, even the long sigh of a world relieved. All of it compressed into a single beat of silence, and then gone. Micah's eyes filled. He turned toward her. "Is it over?" Juno shook her head slowly. The light from the clouds washed over her face, turning her skin almost translucent. "No," she said, barely more than a whisper. "It's just staying still long enough to listen back." The sea, as if understanding, answered with a sigh. Not a wave, not a rush, just a gentle release of water returning to stillness. It sounded like gratitude. The ridge dimmed further, its faint gold lines folding deeper into the soil until only memory held their outline. The hum was gone, truly gone this time, yet Juno felt it more vividly than ever. It wasn't absence. It was absorption. The ridge no longer needed to speak, because the world around it had learned the dialect of quiet. Birds perched on telephone wires, wings tucked, unafraid. A child on the pier held a jar of seawater up to the light and giggled at the way it shimmered faintly, unaware that she was holding a small piece of history between her hands. From somewhere inland, the church bell rang once, not from resonance this time, but from choice. Someone, somewhere, had decided that sound could exist again without demanding attention. Juno smiled. For the first time, silence wasn't a wound to be filled. It was a presence to be shared. She walked with Micah back toward town, the tape deck cradled like an artifact. Inside it, the reels had stopped spinning again. But Juno didn't mind. They had recorded enough, not voices, not words, but the breath between them. On Main Street, the evening light turned everything soft and precise. The diner's reflection in a puddle, the faint hum of a generator that no longer needed a hum, the rhythm of her footsteps syncing perfectly with the tide. When they passed the old radio tower on the hill, Micah stopped. Its dish, rusted and still, caught a slant of sunlight, and shone for a moment like an old coin finding purpose again. "Do you think it'll ever speak again?" he asked. Juno considered this. "It already is, just not in a way that needs to be heard." They watched as the last of the light slid down the ridge, tracing its contours like a closing eye. The town breathed once more, unified, steady. And for the first time, the silence that followed didn't feel like the end of sound. It felt like the sound had finally found its home, a resting place vast enough to hold everything that had ever been said, and everything that never needed to be. Needlepoint was no longer listening for the world. It was listening with it. And somewhere beneath that gentle, endless quiet, the ridge exhaled, content, unseen, eternal. That night, a warm wind moved through Needlepoint, slow, deliberate, and unfamiliar. It carried no scent of salt, no hint of storm, only a pulse that made the curtains flutter in rhythm with breathing. The lights in the houses flickered softly, not from power surges, but from resonance. Floorboards swelled and sighed. Hinges turned themselves to the gentlest position. The wind pressed its palm to each window, as though counting the hearts inside. Juno lay awake, listening. The house had traded creak for murmur. Even the old radiator made a thoughtful sound, heat traveling like a whispered apology through iron bones. Somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, the silence began to speak, not in words, but in tone. It wasn't the ridge, not anymore. The voice was wider, like a lake that had learned to be sky, as if the air itself had grown patient enough to form thought. "You taught us pause. We taught you return." The sentence didn't arrive. It settled, like dust choosing a ledge. Juno sat up, heart steady, unafraid. She didn't reach for the lamp. She let darkness keep its work. The golden threads that once stretched through the sewing room had faded, but when she closed her eyes, she could still feel them humming faintly beneath her skin. Old routes now grown domestic, like streets you no longer need a map to find. She wasn't the receiver now. She was part of the signal. Outside, the night glowed faintly blue, not a color so much as a temperature of thought. The lilac bushes, leafless and dignified, ticked in time with the wind's careful breath. Somewhere down the block, a door latched itself without complaint. Another unlatching answered it from across town, because balance had become a habit. Juno stepped into her shoes and padded barefoot to the porch. The boards under her soles recognized her and adjusted, the way a friend shifts on a bench to make just enough room. The warm wind moved across her ankles, upper shins, a shawl crocheted by invisible hands. On the road stood Micah, his hair sleeping in all directions. His radio pressed his chest away one holds a sleeping child, both to keep and to keep from waking. "It's broadcasting again," he whispered when she joined him. His voice matched the night, deliberate, precise, unwilling to bruise the air. The static on the radio wasn't noise. It was rhythm, the soft knit of everything that breathes. A pulse rose through the speaker and returned through their ribs. For counts in, for counts out, a pause at the end like a door held open for whoever came next. Juno leaned closer and found it was breathing, the same as the tide, the same as her own. Micah angled the radio slightly and the tone widened, as if satisfied to include the road, the ditch grass, the dark undercarriage of parked cars, the moths organizing their private evangelisms around the porch light. The wind threaded the tone through every culvert and attic. Inside the houses, babies turned on their sides without waking. Dogs lifted their heads and lowered them again, convinced they were part of a job well done. Then came the words, layered, tender, woven through the hum, the kind of speech that holds your hand instead of your ear. Needlepoint remained, because it remembered to listen. Juno felt her shoulders let go of a posture she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It was not relief exactly. It was a permission to be a person again, smaller, specific, mortal, without betraying the vastness that had visited them. She looked past the roofs toward the ridge. All along the long curve, faint lights flickered, not geometric this time, but organic, moving like slow auroras crawling along the ground. They didn't announce. They investigated. They spread over the fields, down the valley, across rooftops, their glow a conversation with wood, with asphalt, with frost on trash can lids. Wherever they touched, the air brightened as though the world were exhaling centuries of held breath. The town's paint deepened a shade. The glass in its windows forgot a quarrel with smudges. Gravel in driveways lay down and aligned, each stone finding its best face. Micah laughed quietly, tears already traveling with purpose. His face looked younger in the blue, like a photograph that had finally been washed correctly and left to dry. "They're not leaving this time," he said, as if the sentence were a field-tested truth. Juno smiled. "They never did. We just had to stay still long enough to notice." They stood in the road shoulder to shoulder while the wind revised the night into something nearer to accuracy. Behind them, the house dreamed with its windows open. The sewing room, once all glow and glamour, now held a slower intelligence, the memory of a loom after a harvest. On the wall where threads had once mapped the town's veins, the moon through the glass drew a pale circle and let it hold. The lights converged above the harbor, not racing so much as convening. The way friends who had stopped needing to impress only need a table. Over the water, they formed one last column, not a spear but a spine. It rose in increments that matched breath. For a moment, it hovered, trembled, a held note seeking its rightful chord, and then it split into hundreds of smaller lines that scattered in every direction. Toward the sea where the whales slept and dreamed of vowels. Toward the sky where frost keeps secrets on aircraft wings. Toward the stars that aren't just far but patient. The wind paused, as if signing the last page. The night held its breath. Every porch and needlepoint dimmed half a shade in sympathy with the pause, and you could feel, in that concerted gentleness, the exact size of human decency. And then, in the softest voice imaginable, as if the speaker had learned courtesy from watching nurses untie knots, the radio spoke one final time. Every frequency harmonized, every silence folded into sound. The sentence settled on them, like a blanket not tucked too tight. "We're keeping the quiet safe for you." The words did not echo. They were not built for replay. They were built for staying. For a while no one moved. The night resumed its ordinary noises. Some invented, some recovered. A car cooling in a driveway ticked. A distant freight rolled over a trestle and set the river thinking in iambs. An owl considered a question and decided it could wait. The warm wind put its hand on the backs of their necks and left it there, the way family does when family is good. Dawn came reluctantly, and then all at once, like someone who composed a kind letter and, proud of each sentence, delays the stamp. The ridge was just a hill again. Grass, rock, the plausible industry of lichens. But the light didn't fade. It lived quietly beneath the soil, pulsing like memory, like a town's first language installed beneath the new one, waiting for the next person brave enough to listen. Bravery had changed shape. It no longer meant stepping into the impossible. It meant staying with the obvious long enough for it to open. Juno and Micah walked toward the harbor, because habits that were once survival had become pleasure. The road carried a fine veil of dust the rain had missed, not neglect, evidence. In the diner window, Janine taped up a hand-lettered note that nobody needed and everybody loved. "Back at 9. Be at ease." Beneath it, a tin of muffins cooled their pride. Someone had left a button on the sill with a note that said, "For whatever needs fastening." On the pier, the tide breathed away a kind teacher, counts a room of children. For in, for out. It didn't need to be perfect. It needed to be present. The boats responded not as property, but as partners, ropes sighing, hulls nuzzling each other with the decorum of large animals who know their sizes. The old radar dish on Cemetery Hill turned neither outward nor down. It faced the town at last, content to measure how much staying a day can hold. They sat with their legs dangling over the water. Micah set the radio beside him and turned it off, then on, then off again, discovering the dignity of devices that don't have to prove themselves. Juno placed the tape deck on the planks and didn't press anything. The machines warmed each other by proximity. The way two old stories at the same table learned to gently correct each other's dates. "Do you ever worry it will fade?" Micah asked, not fearfully, curiously, like a person checking the oven not because the cake might burn, but because cakes are beautiful while becoming. "What would be?" Juno said, "The light, the hum, the way dogs look at doorways now as if the next room deserves respect." He smiled. "All of it." Juno thought of the sentence, We're keeping the quiet safe for you. I think fading is just the part where things learn to live where we can't monitor them, she said, which is to say, inside us. So we're the tower now. We're the town, she corrected. We're the field. We're the plank. We're the breath count and the pause. She covered his hand with hers. We're the ones who stay. He nodded, eyes on the water. Then we should practice. They did. They breathed on 4. They held the pause kindly. A gull landed near them and refused to ruin the moment with its usual politics. Somewhere behind them, someone in the cannery struck a nail true and then laughed at the perfection, which is the only way to spend the energy safely. The day arranged itself around usefulness. Janine returned at 9 on the nose and opened without unlocking, because nothing had been locked. Children brought their jars to the tide and learned that collecting doesn't always require taking. A man repaired a gate and then stood with his hand on it while it swung, praising the hinge without making it self-conscious. An elderly woman walked a long block to the field and left on the cedar plank a deck of cards from which she had removed all the jokers years ago. The plank accepted the deck and, in doing so, restored the jokes to wherever jokes wait. Toward afternoon, Juno climbed to the sewing room. She opened the window, not for air, but for the sentence air carries. The threads on the wall were not gold anymore. They were cotton, ordinary and exquisite. She took a needle from the tomato cushion, threaded it without looking, and found herself mending a small tear in the sheer curtain. The stitch remembered its own history, not showy, not invisible, but honest. When she tied the knot, she felt in her chest a small closure that didn't diminish anything. She set the needle down and pressed her palm to the table. Beneath it the wood hummed a fraction, less a sound than a willingness. She closed her eyes and the town came. The cannery bench warmed from use, the porch chairs aligning themselves for dusk, the plank with its new offerings that weighed exactly what they meant to. She saw the ridge not as an altar but as a neighbor, a good one, the kind who returns your shovel months later sharper than before. Evening moved in, and with the warm wind again, though softer now, like a satisfied animal circling once before sleep, people found their porches and their pauses. Someone began a song, and then wisely stopped before it became performance. Someone else finished the line, without injury, to the silence. The church bell did not ring. It wasn't needed. Sound had learned its place in the queue. In the road, Micah stood with the radio under his arm. He didn't turn it on. He held it the way one holds a book in a house full of readers. You know you could open it at any moment, which is why you don't. Juno joined him, and they walked to the field that shouldn't have existed, and now could not plausibly not. The warm air fence recognized them, touched their wrists, there you are, and parted. At the plank, someone had written in pencil, halfway down the board, a sentence without author, "Let quiet be a common." A paperclip heart kept it company. Next to it lay a small toy car, missing a wheel. Juno set her palm on the wood. The board accepted the inventory and asked no origin stories. Above the field, bats wrote legible cursive. The ridge in the near dark was only a darker dark. It didn't need to glow. It had tenure. Tomorrow, Micah said, we should write the last page. Juno tilted her head. There isn't one. I know, he said, smiling. But something for the book, so people who arrive later can see where it began. She nodded, put the breath marks on every line. And the pause. She looked out at the town. In living rooms, lamps found their appropriate brightness. In kitchens, hands found the quiet cut. On stoops, neighbors discovered the luxury of short sentences that mean long things. The pause, she said, goes wherever someone is brave enough to keep it. They stayed until the bats gave the sky back to stars. The wind lifted once, as if checking the tuck of a blanket, and then forgot it had hands. On the way home, they passed the radio tower. It gave them nothing. They loved it for that. In the harbor, the tide let itself be led. They loved it for that, too. Before sleep, Juno set the tape deck on the table and pressed record without ceremony. The reels turned once in courtesy and then stopped, deciding there was no need to mistrust tomorrow. From somewhere under the ridge, or above the ridge, or through the ridge, directions had lost their bragging rights. A kindness moved through the house. It found the thread of her grandmother's old perfume in the closet wood. It found the corner where children like to hide when the rules of grief are too complicated for them. It found Juno's heartbeat and did not change it. It copied it down with excellent penmanship and filed it where breath keeps its archives. Before the last light left the window, she heard a voice, the same one that wasn't a voice, and it said without pressure, "Keep it. Keep the quiet. We will do the same." She woke once near midnight to thunder that never sounded. The warm wind had gathered itself and was moving over the ridge, slow and ceremonial, the way a caretaker moves through rooms at closing. The houses exhaled. The streets released the day's weight. The town kept what it could and gave back what it must. When dawn came again, it found the hill unremarkable and holy, the way a kitchen table is after the dishes are put away and the lamplight is right. The light didn't arrive in trumpets. It arrived in small, accurate gifts, the exact hue of the harbor at 6:12, the slight scratch of a pencil that needs sharpening soon but not yet, the smell of bread at Janine's that will make its own case at the door, the sound of the tide counting in a language everybody finally speaks fluently without translating. The ridge was just a hill again, but just had become a sacred word. And beneath the soil, beneath feet, beneath houses, beneath the plank in the garden and the radio tower's honest rust, the light continued its quiet work, pulsing like memory, like an oath, like a door left unlocked on purpose, waiting not for trumpets, waiting for the next person brave enough to listen. By morning, the fog had thinned to nothing but memory. The air over Needle Point was clear, almost too clear, as though the sky had been freshly washed and left dry on a line only the horizon could see. The light came in without argument. Colors sharpened but did not shout. The ridge stood still, unlit, just a hill again, its silhouette plain as a hand at rest. Yet anyone who looked at it could feel, in the softest chamber of the chest, the heartbeat beneath the soil, a low, patient thrum that had learned to live without spectacle. Juno tied her laces and spent the day walking, not to look for signs, not to chase what was gone, but to understand what had stayed. She moved the way a person walks through a house after guests have left, noticing which chairs remember warmth and which rooms feel larger because silence has arranged the furniture better. Clocks ran true again, but the town had not let go of slowness. People spoke softly, as if speech had been returned with a note that said, "Use kindly." Even the sea seemed to breathe with care. The tide no longer lunged. It negotiated. She started on Fairlane, where the maples lifted their leaves to the clear light as if dry for the first time in a season. A woman on a ladder washed the big front window of what used to be the barber shop. She left one corner undone, a small triangle of fog glass. For humility, the woman said when Juno paused. So the sun doesn't get ideas. They smiled without explaining why that made sense. At the school, children lined pebbles on a low wall in spirals and commas. Their teacher did not correct the grammar of stones. A boy with a cowlick tapped a rhythm on the railing. For 3, 2, 1, and the others, without cue, allowed a pause big enough for breath to sit down. On a chalkboard by the door someone had written, "Practice the hold, then release it." The sentence looked as though it had been written by a hand that had learned patience from a metronome. The canneries sounded different. Hammers and motors found tempos that didn't grind. Work folded itself into the count the town had learned, as if labor had discovered the right stride length. Along the side lot, coils of rope rested like sleeping snakes, and in each rope lay a small loop left intentionally, a kindness for the future, a promise that nothing would be tied without a way to untie. At the diner, Janine kept the sign, open for quiet, but hung it lower, as if even that truth wanted to be closer to the ground. She placed coffees on the counter with the same gentle accuracy as a nurse taking a pulse. Somewhere inside, a radio sat turned off and still felt heard. A child climbed onto a stool and did not swing her feet. She simply watched the steam organize itself over a cup and whispered, "It knows we're watching." No one corrected the tense. On Wharf Street, the air tasted like metal polished by memory. Someone had repainted a door the same color it had been in the year a certain person left and promised to return. The color looked like a vow still learning to be humble. Juno stopped by the post office and noticed the bulletin board was oddly spare. No lost items, few notices. Instead, a single sheet with 4 lines. Breathe on 4. / leave room. / return kindly. / repeat. Whoever had tacked it, there had used 2 pins only, as if trust should be given a little movement. She took the lane behind the grocery, where the back steps of the town make their private confessions to peeling paint. An orange cat, the precise orange of saved sunset, stalked the shadow of a sparrow and then changed its mind and lay in a square of light instead. When she bent to touch it, the cat's purr vibrated exactly with the now familiar subterranean pulse. It blinked once at her, a slow agreement. Everywhere, the ordinary had kept something from the extraordinary, a posture, a count, a generosity with attention. Juno passed the church and found the doors propped open to air that walked softly. The bell rope had been retied so it would not ring by accident. Sound had become liturgy again, not advertisement. Inside, the hymnals sat where hands could find them without drama. On the lectern, a scrap of paper. Sermon, less. Practice, more. She touched the edge of the page and felt it accept her fingerprints without possessing them. When she reached the field that shouldn't exist, the meadow that had unfolded when a ridge first learned to be gentle, the fence of warm air remained, delineating without warning. She stepped through and felt the quick, friendly brush along her wrist, like passing a friend in a small hallway. The cedar plank rested on its stones. The offerings are quieter today. A paperclip reshaped into a fish, a watch spring, a drawing of a door with no knob, a small string knotted, and then unknotted and left like that, a sculpture of permission. Juno placed nothing. She set her fingertips on the wood. It retained the day's work and returned a fraction of it as heat. By the time she reached the harbor, the afternoon had stretched itself thin enough to be folded. Micah sat on the dock with his legs dangling above the water, shoes off, toes remembering the temperature of courage. His radio was gone. In its place, the faint circle of light it had burned into what remained, a modest halo, varnished by weather into testimony. He didn't turn when she sat. He didn't need to. They had learned a better preface than conversation. "You hear it?" he asked at last. Juno nodded. "Not with my ears. It's quieter than that." He smiled faintly. The line at the corner of his mouth had softened in recent days, as if some argument had been resolved. "Maybe that's what it wanted all along," he said, "to teach us to stop speaking long enough to listen." They watched the harbor's surface hold its breathing. Rings formed and faded without declaring their origins. Fish, wind, the ridge, the town. Causes had stopped needing credit. A boy knelt 3 slips down and trailed his fingers, learning the difference between disturbing and touching. A gull landed on the piling and did not ask the water to translate it. The sun lowered to the angle where wooden things admit their grain without embarrassment. The last light fell across the ridge, and for a moment the hills shimmered, not glowing, not rising, just remembering. The shimmer was like breath on glass, evidence without insistence. Veins of gold traced themselves across the slope. Faint as a thought a person will not say aloud for fear of making it too proud. The hum returned, softer than ever, the lullaby a world sings to itself after deciding to live. Micah's hand found hers. The skin between their fingers had the same cautious heat as fresh bread. "You think it's over?" he asked, not with dread, but with the pragmatism of people who have finally accepted that endings are chores that require light effort. Juno shook her head. "I think it's beginning differently." A dog barked once on a far road, and then reconsidered. The sky pulsed once, a slow rhythm, like a heartbeat stretched across clouds. It wasn't the alien precision from before. It was a humanized version, softened by having learned our frailties. The pulse made no demand. It offered a count. From somewhere far beneath the ridge, a voice rose, not separate, not commanding, but woven through wind and tide and trees the way a promise we keep shows up inside smaller acts. It spoke where words go when they refuse to startle. We are what remains when the sound becomes its listener. The sentence passed through Juno like a low tide through eelgrass, leaving everything where it had been but cleaner. Tears warmed against the cooling air. She didn't swipe them away. The face has its own housekeeping. "Then we're not alone, are we?" she whispered. The reeds along the shore moved. Not a gust, an answer. The vibration was soft enough to pass for silence, and full enough to feel like touch. The dock boards creaked once in contentment. Somewhere behind them a screen door clicked in that small, right way that tells a house it is loved. Lights blinked on across town, one by one, not as defense against darkness, but as participation. Porch lamps, kitchen bulbs, the small night light at the foot of a child's bed, all negotiated their glow with the dusk. So neither would be embarrassed by the other. No window blazed. Each breathed. The ridge exhaled once. The air trembled the way a glass trembles when you're careful with it. For the first time since the beginning, the world and its echoes were in harmony. It felt like an orchestra that has finally stopped tuning, because everyone has agreed on A and decided to keep it kind. They stayed until dark completed its work. Under the dock, small things went about their small lives. A crab found a shell and decided against theft. A school of minnows rehearsed agreement. The star of the harbor lamp laid a straight path across the water and did not brag. Juno rose. The body knows when to stand when a day has ended honestly. She and Micah walked the planks without conversation. At the top of the ramp, they turned and looked back, something like etiquette toward the sea. Gratitude, curtsy, dismissal, see you in the morning. The water did not wave. It kept time. They took the long way home, past the laundry with its lines strung bare as a staff waiting for music, past a lot where teenagers had drawn a circle in chalk and learned to enter it without disturbing its edge, past the alley where the orange cat had moved a foot to the left and now occupied a rectangle of shadow with the confidence of a deed. On Cemetery Hill, the tower stood the way elders stand at kitchen sinks, present, available, free of a need to make an announcement. Its dish caught a late star and handed the light down to the wires, which carried it exactly as far as it needed to go and then let it rest. Juno's grandmother's house received her with a window already cracked to the night. The sewing room slept. The threads on the wall, long since dim, still drew the town in lines you could follow with your eyes closed. Diner, cannery, school, ridge, harbor, field. She touched the sill, would answer with a hum of lumber that has remembered forests. In the kitchen, she poured water into a glass and listened to it learn the shape it had been given. The small ring it left on the table felt like a diary entry the day was allowed to write. She went outside again. The street had emptied of footsteps, full of breathing instead. Micah sat on her front step with 2 slices of toast wrapped in a towel, the sacrament of midnight, offered without denomination. They ate with the quiet of people who trust the math of hunger and bread. "Think it'll hold?" he asked. "What?" "This gentleness." "It's not a balloon," she said. "It's a habit." Then softer, "And habits keep if you keep them." Across the road, a bedroom light blinked twice. Not code, courtesy. Juno found her gaze climbing back to the ridge. The hill was only a hill, the way the word only sometimes means finally. She imagined the veins of gold folded within like lines of a letter put away, but never forgotten. She imagined the field at its base, the plank, the pencil with its new teeth marks. She imagined the pause practice on porches throughout needlepoint, the count begun, held, shared, released. She closed her eyes and whispered the only thing that still felt necessary. "Thank you for listening back." The ground answered with a hum so slight it might have been imagined by a person good at imagining. The tone was not triumph. It was housekeeping, the sound of something vast and kind folding itself into quiet, so people could sleep. When she lay down, the night did not press. It covered, lightly, the way a parent covers a child who has insisted they are not tired and is already drifting. Wind moved gently through the bones of the house. The radiator considered its responsibilities and kept them. Outside, gravel introduced itself briefly to tires and then excused itself. Sometime after sleep chose her, the stars did the strangest, most ordinary thing. They did not shine so much as breathe. Tiny, measured exhalations, old light practicing a new courtesy. Pulse, hold, release. Above the valley, constellations remembered their first job, to be counted by people who need counting, and their second, to be forgiven by people too tired to count. They pulsed together once, a reminder that maps work both ways. Outward to wonder, inward to rest. Morning would come like a letter walked up the steps by a careful carrier. A soft knock, then the envelope on the mat, then the good weight of paper in a hand practiced at opening without tearing. The ridge would be a hill again, as promised. The harbor would keep its arithmetic. The town would pour coffee and hold the pause and mean it. And beneath the soil under the road, inside the plank and the tower and the floorboards and the littlest bones of the littlest wrists, the hum would keep its vow. Not to call attention to itself, only to keep time while humans learn the tune. For now, the world and its echoes agreed. Harmony first, history second. The quiet did not cave or flee. It lived, it learned, it kept, and needlepoint, having once been taught to listen by light, continued the lesson among themselves. Breathing on 4, opening the window a little, setting an extra chair by the door in case the night brought someone who needed the kind of welcome that sounds like nothing, feels like everything, and leaves behind no headline. Only a room where the air remembers your name. Dawn arrived without announcement. No color first, no trumpeting chorus of gulls or the rustle of wind through the reeds. Only light, soft and slow, spilling across the ridge like forgiveness taking its time. The valley exhaled in small motions, dew surrendering to warmth, curtains drawing the breath of morning, a kettle remembering that boiling is not the only way to speak. The air carried a weight that didn't belong to weather. It was warmth made of memory, the residue of something vast that had chosen to stay. Every surface, grass, roof, skin, seemed to glow faintly from within, as if the world had swallowed a sunrise and decided to keep it. The colors came later, modestly. They crept in like grateful guests, tinting leaves, teasing windows, painting faces with the faint gold of continuation. Juno stood at the edge of her grandmother's field, where the fog used to gather like unfinished thoughts. The air there felt old and kind, touched by all that had passed and yet unscarred. She watched the line where the hill met the sky, a seam once filled with mystery, now stitched with calm. The hum was gone, but its pattern lingered in her body, the rhythm behind her ribs, the steady tremor connection that refused to fade. It wasn't silence anymore. It was peace pretending to be quiet. The ground beneath her boots held a warmth too deliberate to be ordinary sunlight. The soil, dark and damp, seemed to pulse underfoot in slow, forgiving intervals. She could have sworn it breathed back at her, matching her inhale for inhale, like an animal asleep, but listening in its dreams. Down the road, the town had begun to live again, not reborn, but refined. The same buildings, the same faces, but all of them softened, edges sanded down by reverence. The diner opened at 6 sharp, as it always had. The bell over the door rang once, delicately, not as alert, but as acknowledgement. Janine poured coffee with both hands now, her movements deliberate, each pour a prayer. Her wrists no longer trembled. Her smile no longer apologized. Even her laughter found a new pitch. Lower, steadier, shaped to fit this quieter world. The postman walked slower, delivering letters as if they carried the weight of new understanding. Children played by the tide, their shouts folding easily into the sound of water. The sea had learned something, too. It rolled in with intention, its waves not crashing but arriving. Each pulse of surf corresponded to their feet, to the tempo of joy, to the proof that play could also be ceremony. When Juno turned, she saw Micah approaching from the dirt path that wound between wildflowers. He had left his usual bag behind. No radio, no notebook, no measuring instruments. Only a single cassette in his hand, blank, label-free, a square of quiet promise. Empty tape, he said, almost sheepish. Thought maybe I'd record the quiet. Juno's smile curved like a sunrise answering another. You think it'll stay still long enough for that? He shrugged, eyes half amused, half reverent. Maybe it doesn't have to. They stood together in a hush that wasn't quite silence, just the world taking its time. The ridge before them shimmered faintly, not glowing as it once had, but breathing, its slopes warm with morning. The gold veins that carved themselves into memory still flickered below the surface, seen only by those who remembered how to look sideways at wonder. The air shifted. The light deepened. Sun spilled across the water in a slow bloom of gold. And for a brief moment, the sea and the sky appeared to share a single pulse. The ridge joined them, a low tremor running through its roots, faint but certain. Grass quivered. Pebbles answered with tiny shivers. Even the shadows seemed to nod. Then it happened. the exhale, the world released a long-held breath. And in that exhale, Juno heard everything, not with her ears, but in her bones, in the marrow that remembered before thought. She heard every voice that had ever spoken in needlepoint. The laughter at breakfast tables, the murmurs behind curtains, the sighs that meant both surrender and relief. She heard every silence that had once been mistaken for absence, pauses heavy with love unspoken, grief folded into endurance, the quiet between heartbeats when hope still considers staying. And threaded through it all, she heard the ridge's low, ancient tone, the song that had been waiting centuries to finish, not because it didn't know how, but because it had needed listeners who could understand that endings are only soft beginnings. It wasn't music. It wasn't even sound. It was recognition. The feeling of two halves of meaning meeting again after a long misunderstanding. Micah turned to her, eyes wet but steady. It's remembering us. Juno shook her head gently, her smile as soft as the morning. No, she said, it's remembering with us. From the crest of the ridge, a single beam of light rose, narrow as thread, unwavering. It stretched upward, dissolving as it climbed, weaving itself into the pale fabric of sky. For a few moments, the horizon shimmered, not blinding, not divine, but aware. Clouds caught the light and folded it into their bellies, carrying it outward, dispersing it with care. All sound returns, the air whispered. It wasn't voice or vibration. It was a truth shaped by everything alive. All silence remains. Juno's breath caught in her chest. She crouched, pressing her palm flat to the earth. The soil was warm, softer than it had ever been, rich with memory and forgiveness. Beneath her fingertips she felt a pulse. Not her own, not the ridges exactly, but something larger, ancient, patient. The heartbeat of the world, steady and infinite, content at last to be heard. She closed her eyes. Behind her lids, the light wasn't beams anymore. It was memory, woven threads connecting every living thing. Sky to sea, word to breath, listener to sound. The web of connection pulsed faintly. Each vibration a reminder that nothing truly ended, that every silence still hummed with what it once contained. The wind passed through the field, its tone more melodic than ever. It wasn't calling now. It was keeping time, marking the rhythm of a world that had chosen to balance itself between echo and pause. Micah knelt beside her, setting the blank cassette gently in the grass. It reflected the sun in soft silver. Maybe that's all we can record, he said quietly. The space that remembers. Juno looked at him and nodded. Then we keep it that way. The wind curled around them, threading their words through the stems of the grass, carrying them toward the ridge. Beneath their feet, the earth answered, not as rumble or quake, but as breath. A single inhalation shared between soil and skin, between world and witness. The light spread farther now, drifting through the valley like a closing cord. The town shimmered faintly under it. The diner, the dock, the steeple, the old tower, all glowing not as objects, but as continuations of one long note. The air felt full but not crowded. Complete, Juno tilted her face to the sun. The warmth met her halfway. Her voice, barely more than thought, escaped like a secret. Now it's our turn to listen. And somewhere deep beneath the field, under the roots and stone and time itself, the ridge answered. Not with thunder, not with song, just a sound so gentle it could barely be separated from stillness. The light settled. The air held still. The sea, the trees, the hills, all drew a final, shared breath. And then peace. Not absence, not sleep. Peace, the kind that hums faintly in the bones long after the music has stopped, the kind that stays. The world, at last, remember how to rest. And the quiet it left behind was not an ending, but a promise kept.